Unsolved disappearances are rare. Unsolved disappearances which occurred within roughly the same geographic area are even more rare. Unsolved disappearances of young, dark-haired women in which the cars were left behind in both cases are exceedingly rare. And yet, all of these attributes apply to the disappearances of Maura Murray and Brianna Maitland. And that alone is cause for some questions, but there's actually more to the story. Because when I dug in, I found that the police had not been entirely forthcoming about their work. And maybe that's why two disappearances, which are almost completely identical, remain unsolved to this day. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome to the compiled version of our series on Maura Murray and Brianna Maitland here on the Lore Lodge. In today's video, I'm wearing clothes. That's probably good news to most of you, though based on my DMs, there's a select group of men who would prefer it otherwise. And why do I bring this up, you ask? Well, look closely at my clothes then and my clothes now. They're different. In fact, I'm wearing different clothes in most of my videos, though now not so different as before. What I'm really trying to say is that my wardrobe is actually consolidated quite a bit because now I almost exclusively wear Fabletics. That's not a joke, it is most of my wardrobe now. Now, what is Fabletics? Well, in 2014, Fabletics set out to revolutionize the athletic wear industry by combining the pinnacle of form and function, blending a unique fashion sense with an obsession for quality to create the ultimate luxury athletic wear. The result has been a wide range of optimized clothing for both men and women, with soft but durable high-performance materials featuring bold prints and colors, all at an affordable price point. And of course, this moisture-wicking quick-dry material features internal and external pockets to provide a flexible but supportive base for all your active needs. So there's really nothing I would rather wear for a day out on the trails. I mean, look guys, there's a lot of stuff I could say about the brand, a lot of, options they gave me for, suggested items and things that people might grab onto and, help sell the product or whatever. But frankly, I think that what you guys should take away from this is I do use these. I do wear the product frequently. I'm very comfortable in it. I did bring it with me to Montana and California. Whenever I go hiking, this is what I wear. And honestly, I don't just wear it like doing outdoorsy stuff. This is just my normal clothes now, is just Fabletics. It's all Fabletics. All of it will be Fabletics. And with our exclusive link, you can get access to the VIP intro offer, which includes up to 80% off your first order, along with great deals like $19 pants, $10 shorts, $7 tees, and access to VIP-only sales each month when you sign up to become a new Fabletics VIP. This also includes an optional member credit if you want to shop for a given month, allowing your VIP payment to unlock a bundle kit or any item up to $100. So, if you'd like to give Fabletics a try and become a VIP member, check out our link in the description below. Harry and Mike Dutchburn awoke to the sound of someone calling out for them. It was around 2 in the morning on January 31st, 1986, and while the disruption was inconvenient, it wasn't out of the ordinary. The two brothers had been receiving unexpected visitors at their rural Vermont farmhouse for as long as they could remember, most of them stranded drivers who came around the bend too quickly and ended up in a ditch, needed a flat tire changed out, or in this case, simply required a can of gas to get them into the next town. But tonight, something was different. The man outside the door had called out to Harry by name, and yet it wasn't a voice that either of the brothers recognized. The brothers replied from inside the old house, telling the stranger they didn't have any gas to share, only for the mysterious stranger to begin pounding on their front door. And by the time Mike Dutchburn made it downstairs to see what all the fuss was about, the situation had escalated. Two dark, hulking figures could be seen breaking down the door, and all 77-year-old Mike Dutchburn could do was weakly tell them, "You shouldn't be here." One of the intruders, not even caring to answer the elderly farmer, sucker punched him right in the face. It was at that moment that Harry, 2 years his brother's senior, entered the room, only to be knocked out cold by his own wooden cattle prod. Mike managed to resist the intruders for several minutes, but he was quickly overpowered and left bleeding on the floor. Now you see, the Dutchburn brothers were known around the area for their aversion to credit lines and just banking in general, a habit which might have led people to believe that they kept large sums of cash either on their persons or hidden around the property, and it didn't take long for the intruders to validate their suspicion. Harry reportedly had around $7,000 in $100 bills on his person, though the reason for carrying that amount in his nightshirt has never been properly explained, and after relieving him of his financial burdens, the burglars made off into the night. The brutal beating left Harry incapacitated, but after over 3 hours of suffering on the kitchen floor, Mike managed to make the Herculean effort of crawling out to their new Chevy pickup. He drove the half-mile to a neighbor's house as dawn broke, and in doing so likely saved both himself and his brother from certain death. State troopers arrived soon after, and while they initially found no evidence by which to identify the attackers, it did not take them long to track them down. While it might seem shocking, the robbers were not the most intelligent of people, and shortly after stealing thousands of dollars in cash from a pair of old cattle farmers, they made the brilliant decision to purchase a car in nearby Enosburg. This was a rather stupid decision because, even when paid in full at the time of sale, car purchases still require the buyer to provide a legal form of ID and to register the car to their own name and address. Of course, buying a car in cash isn't necessarily a reason for suspicion, but the salesman at Champlain Chevrolet thought something about the transaction smelled a little funny. Specifically, the cash itself. So, when Detective Sergeant Bill Northrup of the Vermont State Police put out a notice to all local businesses to be on the lookout for $100 bills with a strong barn odor, the dealership quickly connected the dots. And as a result, 39-year-old Darrell Clark and 33-year-old Louis Gilbo were apprehended, charged, and convicted within the next 18 months, making this a rare case where the criminals would have almost certainly escaped justice if only they'd thought to literally launder the money. As for the Dutchburn brothers, they never fully recovered from either the psychological or the physical trauma associated with the attack, and while they did return to their home for some time, it wasn't long before they opted to move to a full-time care facility. Mike passed away in 1991, and Harry followed in 1999, and for nearly 20 years their home stood untouched, a solemn reminder of the cruel events of that cold January night in 1986. That all changed on March 20th, 2004, when a Vermont state trooper pulled into the driveway of what had come to be known as the Old Dutchburn House. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to become the first law enforcement officer on the scene for the second major crime to occur at that property, an unsolved mystery which haunts the people of the Green Mountain State to this day. As he stepped out of his patrol car and approached the home, he saw what had prompted the call. Backed into the side of the dilapidated structure, apparently at a high enough speed to break through the wooden siding, was a car. A car belonging to Brianna Maitland. The trooper was looking at a puzzling scene. Before him was a green 1985 Oldsmobile 88 facing westbound off the eastbound side of Vermont Route 118. It wasn't abnormal for cars to go off-road coming around that bend, but it was certainly unusual that they did so driving backwards. And as he approached the vehicle, he noted spare change and a necklace which lay on the ground outside of the car, as well as a squeezed lime wedge which sat on top of the trunk. And taking a look inside the unlocked sedan, he found takeout containers, various non-perishable food items, and a few uncashed paychecks from the Black Lantern Inn, a bar and restaurant in nearby Montgomery. After contacting Lutz's Automotive, an auto shop in the same town which he used to tow the car, he drove over to inquire about the vehicle and its presumptive owner, whose name was present on the checks, Brianna Maitland. The trooper found the inn to be closed, but rather than waiting around for it to open or reporting the mysterious circumstances of the abandoned car so that someone else could follow up, he simply left the vicinity. The extent of the damage caused by that specific oversight may never be fully known, but it certainly didn't put the state police on the best footing with the Maitlands when they arrived at the St. Albans barracks several days later. And contrary to how things might look, there was a good reason for their late missing persons report, which came in on the 23rd. Brianna had, for some time, been living away from home. At the time of her disappearance, she was staying with a friend named Jillian Stout in Shelburne, a town about 20 miles west of Montgomery and 12 miles southwest of her parents' home in East Franklin. And this was not because of any particular issue. The Maitlands simply lived in a very isolated part of Vermont, where Brianna's social and job opportunities were limited, and she wanted to live in a place where she could interact with people her own age and get out of the house. She maintained a good relationship with both parents, and while she didn't own a cell phone, she did communicate with them frequently enough, even going home every now and again to spend time with her family. That habit was the given reason for Jillian Stout's failure to report anything out of the ordinary either, along with the fact that she was out of town from the evening of March 20th through March 22nd. As police would soon come to learn, Jillian last saw Brianna on the morning of March 19th, when she left for school. Brianna was still asleep at the time, having dropped out of high school to work and with the intention of pursuing her GED. In fact, that was the next time someone saw her, because her exam was scheduled for that same day. Her mother Kelly picked her up around 10 in the morning, and then after taking the test, they headed out to do some shopping. At one point, while they were at a store, Kelly noted that Brianna seemed to become agitated, at which point she left the store for several minutes. When she came back in, she appeared nervous, which eventually led her mother to wonder if something had happened while she was outside. Because Brianna didn't have a cell phone, it couldn't have been a phone call, though her father suggested that she might have been going out for a cigarette and hoping to avoid a lecture about smoking from her mother. Whatever the case, Kelly dropped her daughter off at Jillian's around 2:45 that afternoon, but Brianna left for work before her friend returned home from school. She left behind a simple note informing Jillian that she was going to be at work and would likely be home late, and included the phone number for the Black Lantern in case her roommate needed to get in touch. She didn't, and sometime that evening, she left to go out of town for the weekend to visit her sister in St. Albans. It was only when she returned on the 22nd and found Brianna's note untouched in the same place, and no sign of Brianna, that she began to feel a sense of concern. The next day, when Brianna still hadn't come home, Jillian called the Maitlands to ask if they'd seen her, assuming that she must have decided to go spend the weekend with her family. But the Maitlands hadn't seen their daughter, and quickly they began calling around to see if any of Brianna's other friends knew where she might be. When that effort turned out to be fruitless, her father, Bruce, called the Vermont State Police to report both his daughter and her car missing, and was told that an APB would be put out on both Brianna and her Oldsmobile. The police, of course, had all of that information on hand, well, except for the part about Brianna. But because Officer Friendly here hadn't bothered with submitting any of his reports yet, they didn't know that. If it hadn't been for the understandable impatience of Brianna's parents, who knows how long they would have gone on thinking that the car was still missing. But thankfully, Bruce and Kelly weren't willing to just sit around and wait for information to materialize. Instead, they drove down to the barracks, where a particular unnamed state trooper, who I must assume looked extremely sheepish, handed over a few pictures of a 1985 Oldsmobile 88 that he'd had towed on the afternoon of the 20th. And if it wasn't enough that the trooper didn't think to report anything about the car, or that he completely failed to say anything when the APB was released, I can only imagine Bruce's anger when he learned that the trooper hadn't even bothered to check the trunk before leaving the car in a tow yard for 5 days. The comedy of errors only continued to grow when they arrived at the tow yard. Bruce asked the trooper, to whom I will henceforth refer as Farva, if he had the keys to the sedan, and was told that he did, only for him to realize that he in fact did not. As it turned out, he hadn't found any at the scene, that is, assuming he searched at all, and even had to disconnect the transmission linkage in order to have it towed in the first place. Opting for the next best thing, Bruce asked to borrow a crowbar, and finally someone bothered to do the first thing that could be remotely considered investigation. Thankfully, at least in that moment, Brianna was not in the trunk. That meant that she could be alive, but it also meant that they had no leads whatsoever. So, on the 26th, with nothing else to go on, the Vermont State Police searched the area around the old Dutchburn house, assisted by canine units and a helicopter operated by the Vermont National Guard. Now, this was actually the second search of the area, the first having been performed by Bruce as well as Brianna's older brother, Waylon. And if the Vermont State Police were aware of the existence of the word urgency, they certainly did not know the meaning of the term. This was further illustrated by another inexplicable failure in procedure, once again in relation to Brianna's place of work. Not only did it take 9 days for anyone to visit the Black Lantern to inquire about Brianna, but it wasn't even the police who did it. Instead, Bruce himself had to go to the business, whose owners and employees were extremely forthcoming. But still, all they could tell Bruce was that the last they'd seen of her was on the 19th around 11:20 p.m. when she finished her shift, that she'd mentioned having to be up early for work at another restaurant in St. Albans, and that she'd gotten into her car and driven off without trouble. So as far as anyone could tell, sometime between the moment she drove out of that parking lot beside the Black Lantern and the following afternoon, something had happened. Eventually, however, they were able to work out a timeline for the night of Brianna's disappearance, and one which only further confused the situation. Trooper Farva had arrived on scene around 1:15 p.m. on the 20th, but as with everything else so far, he wasn't the first person to stop and investigate. As it turned out, sometime around 8 o'clock that morning, a group of 3 young people, including 2 men and a woman, drove by the old Dutchburn house on their way to Jay Peak. When they spotted Brianna's car, they pulled off the side to look around, sensing that something just seemed off about the scene. Crucially, they had the awareness to take pictures of what they saw. The very same pictures that appear when you search for this case online. That's right, a few 20-somethings thought to take more pictures than the trooper who responded to the scene, who took just one and then destroyed what was very apparently a crime scene by having the vehicle towed before a single CSI could document the situation. As Maitland family private investigator and author of The Hunt for Brianna Maitland, Greg Overacker, put it, the only reason the public has viewed photos of the scene is because this group took the time to capture these images. And they were also able to clarify some details, such as the distance between a coffee cup found on the ground outside of the car and the change nearby, which they said was about 5 feet away. But this still wasn't the first time anyone had come across the vehicle. According to Overacker, beginning shortly after midnight, people spotted Brianna's car backed into the abandoned building. And while they didn't initially contact authorities, they later told investigators that they recalled Bree's headlights and directional signal being on. And this was a change from the scene photographed by the group who spotted the car at 8 a.m., as well as what Trooper Farva saw when he got there that afternoon. Ultimately, a total of 4 more witnesses would come forward, including a man who was on his way to visit family, a boyfriend and girlfriend, and last but certainly not least, someone who actually knew Brianna very well. In his initial statement, the 4th and final known witness to the scene of Brianna's disappearance described coming across the car around 4:30 a.m. on the 20th, and he explained that he didn't contact the police because he was on his way home from a party in Canada and had been drinking. Afraid that he would be arrested for drinking and driving, he instead turned off the headlights and directional signal, closed the apparently open front doors, and drove off into the night. The young man's story would go on to change several times, though mostly with regard to where he was coming from and at what time he saw the abandoned car, but as you might expect, there appears to have been very little investigation into the possibility of his involvement in her disappearance. There should have been, because that witness, a young man by the name of James, was Brianna's on and off boyfriend, and there may have been trouble in paradise. There are some things you need to know about Brianna Maitland. Some are good, some are bad, but all of them are relevant to her disappearance. You see, while Brianna's story may make her sound like the typical troubled teen, the reality is that she was anything but. Contradictory to the stereotypes associated with dropping out of high school, Brianna was a very highly intelligent young woman. Both of her parents were college graduates who deliberately moved away from the hustle and bustle of the more densely populated Honeybrook, Pennsylvania, in order to seek a simpler life in rural Vermont. Admittedly, that is a bit of a joke because Honeybrook isn't much larger than Franklin, but they did go from small-town America to a small farmhouse in the Green Mountain State, and then to a 60-acre farm that was closer to Canada than it was to the nearest American towns of Franklin and Berkshire. Brianna was born while they lived at that first farmhouse in October of 1986, and throughout her childhood on the larger property, she managed to accumulate quite a few skills while developing impressive intellectual capabilities. She attended the local public school until 3rd grade, at which point an issue with a mentally abusive teacher led Kelly Maitland to withdraw her daughter and homeschool her for several years instead, before she rejoined her classmates for middle school. And I can actually identify with that quite a bit, as I experienced a very similar situation around the same age and was homeschooled for both 3rd and 4th grade before returning to my public middle school in the 5th grade. And yes, my local public middle school is 5th through 8th, which is apparently out of the ordinary. It's not my fault. In any case, Brianna became an avid reader during her years at home, developing a love of classic literature to the point where she could recite long passages as they related to her life. When she wasn't studying, she was often enjoying the outdoors, camping in various places around the property, tracking deer with her father and brother, and traveling to the wildernesses of New York and Maine for canoeing trips. According to Overacker and her father, she was even a capable skeet shooter, a skill which, combined with her proficiency in jiu-jitsu, made her a pretty formidable young woman in a fight. On the other hand, the Maitland property was isolated from society, with a driveway a literal mile long, and little in the way of neighbors or activities for more miles. As Brianna grew up, the lack of social opportunities weighed more heavily on her, and by October of 2003, she made the decision to move out and live with friends, something that her parents begrudgingly allowed, although they never gave up on trying to change her mind. And while this afforded the 17-year-old greater freedom, it also created a significant degree of instability. In the months after she left her parents' home on the Canadian border, Brianna Maitland bounced around from house to house, sometimes staying with friends and other times living with her teenage boyfriends and their families. One of these boyfriends, the most recent one by all accounts, was the young man referred to as James in Overacker's book on the case. Brianna had apparently moved in with his family sometime in late 2003, having known them since childhood. And along with dating James, Brianna was also reportedly friends with his sister, but when they broke up in mid-February of 2004, she moved out of that house and in with her friend Jillian. The instability of Brianna's housing situation may have contributed to her disappearance in more than one way. At the time, a severe substance epidemic was developing in rural Vermont, fueled by dealers who operated out of cities such as New York, Albany, and Boston. And according to Overacker, these vultures targeted teenagers, loitering outside of high schools and the few places teens could gather for social activities, like movie theaters, diners, and ice cream shops. And these guys were not just selling the soft stuff. Crack was flooding into the community, and the thin-spread Vermont State Police could do little to stop it. So, with little else to do with their time, many teenagers began to use the substance recreationally, and unfortunately, Brianna was no exception. And while she was by no means a habitual user, she was known to partake at parties, which appeared to have been the main source of entertainment for teens in the area. And that may very well have played into what happened to her on that fateful March night. At one of these parties, less than a month prior to her disappearance, Brianna had been involved in an altercation with a female friend named Kiali, apparently over a boy. And as it turned out, Brianna had spent time with Kiali's boyfriend, which I believe is Overacker's way of politely saying they'd hooked up. As witness reports go, for hours, Kiali had been trying to taunt Brianna into a fistfight, with these witnesses telling investigators that the latter girl tried to defuse the situation over and over again, which eventually led to her leaving the party and going to sit in a car belonging to James, with whom Overacker suggests she'd rekindled a relationship. Then, around 2 a.m., Kiali reportedly confronted Brianna as she sat in the passenger seat waiting for her now on-again boyfriend, and when Brianna rolled down the window to speak with her, Kiali punched her in the face twice. Brianna refused to fight back, despite being very capable of doing so, and instead left the scene and began walking down the road, where she was eventually picked up by a couple of friends. And at the time, Brianna had been staying with James's grandparents, and her friends coordinated to meet up with James's sister, who brought Brianna back to the home and helped her get cleaned up and settled down. The next day, Brianna contacted her parents to tell them about the fight and have them take her to the hospital. And then later, a friend named Shauna LaBelle, one of the only friends that Overacker names in full, drove her to St. Albans to report the attack and file charges. And this episode, in my opinion, deserves more attention than it actually received. You see, when Brianna went missing on the 20th, it caused a bit of a hitch in the legal system. Kiali had a right to face her accuser, and with that accuser nowhere to be found, the case could not proceed. It would have been a different story if a body had been found, but since this was just a missing person, Kiali couldn't be charged with anything beyond the initial assault and battery, and the charges were dropped as a result. And this is what we in the business call motive. Overacker, however, doesn't think Kiali was responsible, and while his book never names a suspect, he does say that he believes he knows who took Brianna, and that his name is written within the pages of this book. Now, I do not have nearly as much information as Overacker does, but I do find some fault with his reasoning regarding the dismissal of Kiali's possible involvement, for much the same reason that I disagree with Lou Smith regarding the JonBenet Ramsey case. Beyond the unlikely reasoning that she somehow decided a couple of punches were inadequate for the situation, writes the PI, and that committing murder, going from a minor offense to potentially spending the rest of her life in prison, would be more appropriate, there are a few other reasons not to suspect Kiali. His first reason is that, despite the seriousness of the altercation, she and Brianna were pretty good friends. He concedes that all of her friends at the party may have been unhappy with Bri, but most of them also said that they loved her, would have done anything to resolve the situation, and that it would have blown over on its own. She also reportedly gave brutally honest answers during interviews with police over the years, some of which were for other offenses, and included statements readily admitting that she would have fought with Brianna again under the same circumstances. Additionally, as Overacker himself explains, Kiali was arrested for other serious offenses in 2012 and 2013. In the 2012 case, police said Kiali LaCrosse of Berkshire was part of a group that entered the home of Samantha Thompson, got into an argument with a man named Dustin Burns, and in the ensuing altercation, LaCrosse struggled with the homeowner Samantha Thompson. According to the local NBC affiliate, the 44-year-old Thompson received a bite on the leg from LaCrosse, who was arrested on burglary and simple assault charges. That, to me, does not suggest a great deal of self-control. But the part that really stands out is who the other suspect sought by police was. It was a man by the name of Trevor LaCrosse, who in 2019 was 29 years old, meaning he was most likely either a brother or cousin of Kiali. And that is two violent criminals in one family, and repeat offenders at that. And while anecdotal, another important detail about this incident comes from Shauna LaBelle, the same friend who drove Brianna to the police station after the attack. In 2011, she told Investigation Discovery's Disappeared that she spoke to Kiali after the attack and asked her what was going to happen with the assault case. And according to Shauna, Kiali smugly replied, "Well, nothing's gonna be happening because Bree's not around right now." Between the repeat offenses, the total lack of remorse, and her allegedly smug remarks to one of Brianna's best friends, I can't help but feel like Overacker is giving this woman entirely too much credit. As with Lou Smith's opinion that parents don't do that to their children, Overacker almost seems to believe that teenage girls aren't capable of heinous crimes, in spite of the evidence to the contrary. The fact of the matter is that young women can be killers, they can convince their male acquaintances to kill on their behalf, and the presence of drugs in the equation only makes both of those possibilities considerably more likely. Kiali LaCrosse is not a non-violent person, as her criminal record plainly shows, and clearly, she doesn't feel sorry about what happened, something that Overacker himself acknowledged. I also think it's worth noting that James, who was present as Kiali apparently rightfully accused Brianna of hooking up with her boyfriend just days earlier, didn't bother to even go looking for his girlfriend after she disappeared. It's possible that he may have been arguing with Kiali's boyfriend, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence of that. Their relationship was obviously rocky, having ended and restarted within 2 weeks since their Valentine's Day breakup, but he may have perceived what she did as cheating. Regardless of whether or not he would have been correct to do so, it also plants possible motive on him for harming Brianna, especially when you consider the fact that his story changed a number of times when police questioned him about finding the car. First, he was on his way home from Canada and saw the Oldsmobile at 4:30 a.m. But when he last spoke to police, he told them that he was just coming home from a friend's house and that he saw it at 2:30 a.m. Those aren't minor changes. And in either case, one would expect that he'd have come forward the next day or called police when he arrived home, since his explanation for not calling right away was that he was worried about being arrested for a DUI. His behavior is unquestionably suspicious, and I think it's relevant that he said he was coming home from Canada the first time, and that he truncated the timeline by the time they finished interviewing him. All of that said, the Vermont State Police know more than I do, so it is possible that something they haven't released rules those people out. Another lead that developed through the party scene was with regard to a pair of scumbag dealers named Raymond Ryans and Nick Jackson, both of whom were eventually linked to Brianna's case when an anonymous female called Bruce to inform him that she believed she knew where his daughter was. It was mid-April, and by this point in the case, the relationship between the Maitlands and the police had soured for numerous reasons. For one, police had told the press that they believed Brianna may have owed a drug debt, that she was some kind of either mule or habitual user, or that she most likely just ran away on her own, while having absolutely zero evidence that any of that was true. Her parents were furious about the lack of police attention, so when that call came in, Bruce, being the absolute action hero he is, called the troopers to let them know about the tip, telling them that if they didn't investigate it, he was going to do it himself. He and a friend were armed and ready to go, and they gave the Vermont State Police the ultimatum that they had an hour to handle it, otherwise he would. Perhaps finally realizing that avoiding any investigation of foul play wasn't a good strategy. I want you to keep in mind, they did not start telling the media they were considering foul play until June. They sent a squad, including state troopers, Fish and Wildlife, and Border Patrol, over to the Reservoir Road house indicated by the tip. While they didn't find Brianna or the root cellar that she was alleged to be in, they did find the 28-year-old Ryans and 26-year-old Jackson hanging out with a 17-year-old Stephanie Machia, as well as coke, the devil's lettuce, guns, and paraphernalia. All of this was in plain view, and though the men denied any knowledge of Brianna's whereabouts, they were arrested on drug and gun charges all the same. And that would have been at least one silver lining, if not for the fact that they were both released without bond and allowed to go right back to what they were doing, just elsewhere in Vermont. Later that year, Ryans fled the state and returned to New York, where he was apprehended by U.S. Marshals and extradited back to Vermont for sentencing. And I want to be clear, that only happened because Bruce went to the U.S. Marshals and asked them. Vermont's Fugitive Task Force told him they could never find him in New York. In yet another shocking miscarriage of justice, Ryans would actually get a plea deal in exchange for telling police what he knew about Brianna, which turned out to be absolutely nothing of value. And he was given a sentence of 1.5 years, all but 45 days to be suspended for the drug and gun charges. The 45 days were considered time served, and he was released. Then it got worse because they let him take a polygraph in exchange for having the charges dropped entirely. Overacker writes several times that he believes the Vermont State Police did their best, but if this is their best, I don't want to even think about their normal. As for why Ryan's left the state and why he was given the opportunity to make that plea deal in the first place, it turns out that he moved to Burlington, where he and his girlfriend Legia Collins sold crack as one happy family until Collins was murdered by a woman named Ellen Ducharme. Ducharme was eventually questioned with regard to Brianna and told police that she knew nothing about her. Then, that she not only was familiar with her, but that she was sure Ryan's had killed her. All of this was accompanied by a series of inconsistent statements from a woman who committed a homicide while on a 3-day crack and alcohol bender and then had her boyfriend hide the body. No evidence ever emerged to suggest that Ryan's was associated with Brianna's disappearance, despite immense police efforts to tie him to the crime. And while Jackson's ex-girlfriend accused him of being involved until the day she died, the police couldn't back up her claims either. I considered including the entire Ducharme saga in this episode, but it just appears to be so entirely irrelevant to the case that it would have been a waste of time and resources. It's all just the self-contradictory ramblings of a legitimately insane woman who hasn't been stable since the 1980s. However, Ryan's wasn't the only miscreant suspected of involvement. Another young man by the name of Jorge Soto, who went by the street name The Joker, was released from prison just 3 days before Brianna's disappearance, and almost immediately began telling everyone who would listen that he killed her. Soto was questioned by police, which really doesn't seem like a given in this absurd case, after reports surfaced regarding his claims that he buried her body in a cornfield behind a St. Albans property. It didn't take long for police to rule him out. The guy was clearly nothing but a small-time drug dealer and general douchebag who was trying to make himself look tough, which happened to be the very explanation he gave police regarding those claims. Overacker did some background work on the Joker and found that he had a pattern of doing this kind of thing, and also that it was essentially impossible that he could have known Brianna prior to her disappearance. He'd been in jail until the 16th of March, and prior to coming to Vermont at the beginning of 2004, he'd been in prison in New Jersey since 1999, which I would argue is potentially the only thing worse than just being in New Jersey. So between Soto being released on the 16th and Brianna going missing on the 19th, there's not much time for them to have met. Brianna spent the 17th with Shauna LaBelle's family, spent the 18th with Shauna again, and was with her mother and then at work all evening on the 19th. It is beyond unlikely that the two ever interacted, and aside from his claims to have been responsible, no evidence links Jorge to the crime. In Overacker's book, he also discusses a few more people who were viewed as suspects, but who he feels are unlikely to be responsible. One of them was Timothy Cruz, who was tied to Ellen Ducharme's case in that he helped hide the body of Legia Collins. Ducharme at one point told investigators that Timothy Cruz helped Ryan's commit the murder, but that was impossible because Cruz was actively incarcerated in March of 2004. Other suggestions that have come along in the intervening years have been more along the lines of infamous killers, such as Israel Keyes, Gerald Montgomery, Brian Rooney, and Howard Godfrey, all of whom were suggested to investigators through various tips, but none of which could be connected to the case. The FBI, despite not being formally involved in the case simply because the Vermont State Police hadn't bothered to ask, was able to confirm that Keyes wasn't responsible because he'd been elsewhere at the time. Montgomery, Rooney, and Godfrey weren't accounted for that night, but there was also nothing tying them to the case beyond being known killers. And I should be clear that these people weren't all suspected in 2004. This has been ongoing since that date. Then again, not everyone believes that Brianna is no longer with us. Jorge, for example, told police in 2006 that she was being trafficked in New Jersey, but he isn't exactly reliable. However, that same year, a casino security camera did capture footage of a woman who bore a resemblance to the missing girl, who would have been 19 years old by that point. The sighting was actually reported by a Vermont man visiting Atlantic City, but after viewing the tape, Brianna's parents weren't confident the woman in the footage was their daughter, nor does there seem to be any explanation as to why she would have been there in the first place. It didn't appear that this woman was being held against her will, and she was actively playing cards at one of the tables. Employees who were shown pictures of Brianna didn't recall seeing her there, and nothing further materialized even after stills from the video were shown on news stations across the Northeast. Even if it were her, the question would still stand out of how she ended up there and what happened on the night she went missing. And as for that answer, there are several theories. Brianna Maitland's car was found backed into an old house on the eastbound side of Vermont Route 118 facing westbound. The lights were on, the front driver and passenger side doors were open, and her keys were nowhere to be found. On the ground outside of the vehicle, a coffee cup, some spare change, and a broken necklace lay scattered, while a squeezed lime wedge sat on top of the trunk. 2 yet uncashed paychecks as well as her wallet sat inside of the vehicle. What happened? One suggestion, which Overacker calls ridiculous, is that Brianna left of her own accord, and I agree with that assessment. If she intended to disappear, it makes no sense that she'd leave uncashed checks and her wallet. The one thing any runaway is going to need above all else is money, and she had none. There was also nothing to indicate that she intended to vanish. She had taken her GED that day, had just finished a shift at one of her 2 new jobs, and left behind additional personal items such as new clothes, contact lenses, and migraine medication. The biggest clue of all was the fact that the car was found in the first place, as it was her best means of escaping her old life and going someplace new. Beyond that, even if she did choose to run away, it seems unlikely that she'd stage her disappearance in such a way that it would cause the family and friends she loved so much heartache and torment. It's ridiculous almost to the point of not meriting mention, writes Overacker, except for the benefit of the reader. And I can't say that he's wrong. A slightly more reasonable theory, and I really do mean slightly, is that Brianna was never at the old Dutchburn house at all. Instead, it's been suggested that she overdosed at a party that night, either accidentally or because someone deliberately gave her too much of something, and then her car was planted at the abandoned house to throw investigators off the trail. But this theory faces a major temporal issue. Brianna left work at 11:20, and her car was first spotted by a reliable witness just after midnight. That means that whatever happened, it had to have happened in just about 40 minutes, which would include her driving to the alleged party, for which nobody could provide a location or any details, overdosing, and then having her car driven out and planted. It's just not feasible, nor would the old Dutchburn house have been anything close to the best place around to hide a car. It is rural Vermont. As Overacker notes, there are countless better places to ditch a car in rural Vermont, including any side road, parking lot, logging road, or field. So, if it was planted, then the person responsible chose one of the most conspicuous locations possible. When everything else is taken into consideration, it just seems immensely unlikely that this is what happened. The remaining 3 mentioned by Overacker are increasingly more plausible, though not necessarily probable. One posits that someone stowed away in Brianna's car while she was at work, and then shortly after she left, her car was literally 2 minutes west of the tavern, a little over a mile, 2 kilometers, that person popped up from behind and grabbed her. There are a number of issues with that theory, not least among them that such an attack would also put her assailant in danger if they tried to physically restrain her. Overacker suggests that this would require the culprit to have either left a car at the old Dutchburn house and then walked 1.5 miles to the Black Lantern, or to have an accomplice who picked him or her up. The PI also argues that 2 people would have been required for this scenario, as one attacker could not have removed Brianna from the vehicle and marched her on foot to a place where she couldn't be found. And while I agree that a second vehicle would probably have been necessary, I do think Overacker overlooked one possibility that ups the chances that this could have happened. The assailant could have had a gun. Still, I don't necessarily disagree that this isn't the most likely scenario, and I realize how many negatives were in that sentence now that I'm reading it. I think of the remaining 2 that he offered, one or the other fits better with the evidence. And those 2 theories suggest that Brianna was either run off the road and abducted, or that she stopped by the abandoned house to meet somebody. Overacker writes that the latter is the more probable, but I'm not sure that I agree with him there. As I previously said, I don't have nearly as much information as he does, but I do have his reasoning to work with. To be clear, Overacker's argument is very solid here. He suggests that she could have pulled off the road to sit in the grassy area beside the house, where she was eventually met by whomever she was there to see. Then, when some kind of altercation transpired, either premeditated or in the heat of the moment, she threw the car into reverse, yanked the wheel hard to the left, and attempted to maneuver her way out of the lot. She would have hit the gas too hard, rammed into the house, and either due to the car being stuck or due to panic, she was unable to get back onto the road. And at that point, she was dragged from the car, abducted, and taken elsewhere, never to be seen again. It's entirely plausible, it doesn't defy reason in any real way, and it doesn't require all that many radical assumptions about what led up to that moment. Brianna was a recreational drug user, so it could have been a deal gone wrong. Or it could have been some kind of setup by someone who she trusted enough to meet there, and that's the part that bugs me. Brianna and many of her friends lived a rather unsupervised life, and they lived in an area where law enforcement was really an as-needed service rather than a common sight on a given town street. Dealers were plying their malevolent wares outside of schools and movie theaters, and it seems that it was an open secret that such things were going on. There must have been places she could have gone to get her fix, essentially any of them infinitely less dangerous than an abandoned farmhouse a mile and a half outside of town. Now, Brianna may have made some reckless decisions, but she wasn't stupid, and agreeing to meet somebody out there could only really be described as stupid. For that reason, I lean towards the other option. Picture this. Brianna gets her new job at the Black Lantern on March 5th, where she is scheduled to work Friday evenings until closing time, and that is between 10 p.m. and midnight. There is one main road leading from her temporary home in Sheldon out to her place of employment in Montgomery, making her route very predictable. Shortly after she leaves for work on the 19th, she approaches the bend where the Dutchburn house sits. As she passes the house, a vehicle emerges from Dutchburn Farm Road on the north side of the highway and blocks her path, forcing her to drive off the road and into the grass. Knowing her ancient Oldsmobile isn't going to be reliable in a drag race, she decides to back up, cut the wheel, and attempt to head back east towards Montgomery, where she can seek refuge with her co-workers at the Black Lantern. Unfortunately, in her panicked state, she overdoes it on the accelerator and finds herself slamming into the Dutchburn house. Before she can get her bearings and try to remedy the situation, the occupants of the other vehicle are on her from each side, dragging her from the car as she tries to fight them off. In the struggle, she knocks a coffee cup holding spare change onto the ground, and her necklace breaks off and falls into the grass. Her assailants find a way to render her unconscious, restrain her, and then she's thrown into their car. One of them drives off with her, while the other prepares to drive Brianna's car off to hide it somewhere on the abandoned farm, or perhaps simply reorient it to look like it broke down and was abandoned. But then suddenly, this individual realizes that the keys are nowhere to be found. Maybe they've dropped into the grass, maybe Brianna managed to get them into her pocket, but whatever the case, the car can't be moved, and so this second attacker hides nearby as they wait for their partner to return for the pickup. Meanwhile, the other driver heads north towards Canada, where he or she disposes of their victim along or across the densely wooded and at the time rather laxly patrolled border with the province of Quebec. Sometime later, they return to the scene of the crime to pick up their partner, only to find that the car is still there. They decide not to stick around and look for the keys, which for all they know could still be in Brianna's pocket, and so they just leave the car there. They shut off the doors and turn off the lights, hoping that the police will just chalk it up to the local drug issues and impound it. Of course, whether that series of events is what actually transpired, or if it was some sort of meeting in the dead of night on the side of a rural highway, there is the question of who did it, and Overacker says he has a good idea of who that may be. After all, he said that he strongly believed a man named in his book was the culprit, and while there's a long list of names in there, he dismisses almost all of them as being unlikely or even impossible. Those names are, so far as I can tell, Timothy Cruz, Jorge Soto, Moses Robar, Israel Keys, Brian Rooney, Jose Rodriguez, Gerald Montgomery, Peter Johns, and Howard Godfrey. Unless I am mistaken, only 3 names in the entire book are never dismissed as suspects. Raymond Ryans, Nathaniel Jackson, and James, Brianna's ex-boyfriend, who is also the person who stopped by her car to turn off all the lights, close the doors, and then not call the police or Brianna's parents. Now, Overacker is clear about one thing, which is his opinion that the killer was a relative stranger. And in my opinion, that, along with the general sentiment in his writing, would suggest that he believes Raymond Ryans was responsible for the disappearance of Brianna Maitland. I don't think that's an absurd conclusion. In fact, I think it's quite reasonable. At least, that's what I thought he was going for. But literally, as I was writing this paragraph, I did a Google search to figure out something that I thought may be related to a comment he made about not naming names for fear of being sued. And that led me to a podcast episode Overacker appeared on in March of 2024, the year after he published The Hunt for Brianna Maitland. In that episode of True Crime PI, he all but says that it was in fact Brian Rooney who attacked Brianna. And not only that, but he argues Rooney was also responsible for the disappearance of Maura Murray about 1 month prior. Reviewing the book, I can now see the sprinkles of these opinions woven into the final pages, though I wouldn't say that they're present in the chapter in which he initially discusses Rooney's crimes. Instead, they seem to be something of a capstone based on intuition and with the admission that there is no hard evidence to support this theory at the moment. That said, I still think there's some flaws with that conclusion. Overacker himself said that he thinks the most likely series of events is that Brianna pulled off at the house because she planned to meet someone there, and goes on to imply that this someone was an older man she'd met either at the Black Lantern or her job at KJ's Diner in St. Albans. Yet in this podcast appearance the following year, while clarifying his opinion from the book, he argues that she hadn't planned to meet Rooney, though she had encountered him before and had even taken a liking to the somewhat charming older man, and that he did in fact intentionally run her off the road, presenting a very similar version of events to the one I formulated. To be clear, I'm not saying any of this to disparage Overacker, or to say that I think he's necessarily wrong. If anything, I'd love to have him come on our live show to discuss his findings and answer some clarifying questions so that I can better understand his perspective. As for my own hypothesis, I personally think that ruling out Brianna's own friends is premature. I think that a lot of people, men in particular, don't understand or don't want to believe that young women can be just as vicious as young men, and especially when it involves romantic conflicts. I think the fact that Keali LaCrosse went on to commit more violent crimes is relevant. I think the fact that she expressed no remorse for hitting Brianna over a teenage relationship, even when asked about it years later, is relevant. Moreover, I think the fact that James didn't do anything to protect Brianna or get her help, either on the night of the assault at the party or after finding her car, is relevant. In fact, this isn't even the first case we've covered in which it seems plausible that a mixed-gender group of young people could have been responsible for the death or disappearance of one of their friends, just as with the case of Tommy Booth, right here in southeastern Pennsylvania. Depending on the status of James and Brianna's relationship at the time she seemingly hooked up with Keali's boyfriend, it could very well be that both James and Keali felt they'd been cheated on. And when you throw hard drugs into the mix, who knows what could have happened? On November 3rd, 2003, two police officers arrived at a residence in Amherst, Massachusetts to conduct a sting operation. Earlier that evening, their department received a call from a young woman reporting that her Fleet Bank credit card appeared to have been stolen, after she discovered a series of charges dating from October 20th onward, which she was certain she had not made. The thief hadn't spent much, with the 6 fraudulent purchases totaling just $79.02, but they had ordered quite a bit of pizza from several shops around town. Officer Carlos Rivera was given the responsibility of investigating the situation, and as he followed up with the restaurants indicated by the report and confirmed by the bank records, he collected receipts from Pinocchio's, Domino's, and Papagino's, with only the last restaurant being one frequented by the card's actual owner. From those receipts, he learned that whoever had stolen the card had a thing for chicken Caesar and fajita wraps, cheese pizzas, garlic bread, and mozzarella sticks. So Rivera may have surmised that those purchases indicated a college student as the culprit, but the fact that they'd all been delivered to an address at Kennedy Hall on the UMass Amherst campus confirmed it. What Officer Rivera couldn't prove was precisely which resident of that dorm was placing the orders. Each receipt bore the same signature, but the police would need to catch the thief in the act if they were to ensure that this hadn't been stolen as well. To that end, he instructed the managers of each of the relevant restaurants to call the police if someone attempted to pay using the card in question. As it happened, the very night of the report, someone did just that, and the Amherst PD sent out patrol officers Pinkham and Reardon to set up a sting. On the orders of the police, Pinocchio sent a driver out to Kennedy Hall with an empty box and called the buyer back with a 15-minute delivery estimate. The driver met the buyer outside of the building, took a signature, and then at that moment, the two officers emerged from their hiding places to confront the thief. She was a 22-year-old college student from Hanson, Massachusetts, and she didn't try to argue about what had just happened. Instead, she complied with their requests, identified herself, and allowed them to follow her up to her room, where she handed over a Fleet Visa debit card bearing her own name. But it didn't match the number on the receipt she'd signed just moments earlier. Something here was off. Officer Pinkham, according to his own report, informed her that now was the time to come clean about where she'd gotten the stolen card number. She thought for a moment, then replied that she had taken the numbers off of the Pinocchio's receipt that she had found on the ground. Pinkham turned to his partner and asked if the receipt in his hand included the full number of the card used to make the purchase, only for Officer Reardon to reply that it did not. It only showed the last 4 digits. Pinkham then turned back to the young woman and asked her once again where she'd obtained the stolen number, only for her to say that maybe it was from a Domino's receipt rather than Pinocchio's. Asked how she remembered the full 16-digit number, she simply looked down at the ground in silence, but after further prompting, walked over to her desk and retrieved a note card with the correct number written on it, as well as several phone numbers and that of a dorm room in the same hall. Officer Pinkham made his way down to the relevant room and knocked on the door, which was opened by another female student. The patrolman then asked if she had any fraudulent charges on her card, and he was told that while the resident of that particular room didn't, her friend who lived in the same building did. Pinkham asked her to call that friend, who arrived soon after, and confirmed that she too had ordered food to the room number written on the note card, and that she had discarded the receipts in empty boxes in the trash room down the hall. A trash room located between that room and the one occupied by the now suspect. The officers then informed the owner of the stolen card that she could expect to hear from Officer Rivera soon and return to speak with their suspect. Upon questioning, she admitted to using the card 6 times, though she refused to explain why she had done so, and the officers left without performing an arrest. 6 days later, the Amherst PD called their suspect in for an interview with Officer Rivera. He showed her all of the evidence compiled against her, informed her of the status of the investigation, and the fact that she was the main suspect for a number of concrete reasons. Though she was not being detained at that moment, was not required to answer any questions, and would not be arrested at the conclusion of the interview. Upon acknowledging that she understood the circumstances, Officer Rivera proceeded to ask her if she had used the card in question, and she confirmed once again that she had, though she did dispute making any purchases from Papagino's. Officer Rivera thanked her for her time and honesty, informed her that she was going to be charged for an unauthorized use of a credit card, and would receive her court summons in the mail. And then she was offered the opportunity to make a written statement regarding why she had done this, which again, to that point, she still had not explained. She once again declined the offer to explain herself, but did apologize for what she'd done, and even offered to make restitution for the stolen money. At which point Officer Rivera advised her that he would notify the court of her cooperation. With that, she left the building, and Rivera turned to writing his report about this strange case, and its even stranger defendant. Her name was Maura Murray, and in just a few months, she'd become the subject of one of the most famous missing persons cases of the 21st century. Maura would go on to disappear on February 9, 2004, after driving her 1996 Saturn S Series off the shoulder of a rural New Hampshire highway, and in the 21 years since that night, a number of theories about what happened have gained popularity. Journalist and author James Renner believes that she may have deliberately gone missing in order to start a new life. Brianna Maitland case investigator Greg Overacker has suggested that both girls might have been victims of a serial killer. Others still argue that she was abducted, either by someone who lured her out to that lonely stretch of road, or simply as a victim of opportunity. All of these theories have their merits and their flaws, and in order to understand why they formed, we have to go back to the very last time Maura was seen alive, and what happened in the days leading up to that moment. On the night of February 5th and into the morning of February 6, 2004, Maura Murray was working at the campus security desk in Melville Hall on the UMass Amherst campus. Previously a cadet at West Point, Maura had made the change after deciding that the military lifestyle wasn't really for her. But the academic rigor and highly motivated spirit which earned her a place at the prestigious military academy hadn't left when she did. She managed to make the dean's list while also working and running on the school's track team, and most who knew her saw a bright future ahead. On this particular night, however, something didn't seem right. It was around 1:20 a.m. when her shift supervisor, Karen Mayotte, realized that Maura seemed to be struggling emotionally. For reasons that were unclear at the time, Maura had started crying, but when Karen tried to comfort her, she refused to explain what caused her distress. And for reasons that are unclear at this current time, Wikipedia suggests that Maura cryptically choked out the words "my sister" to Mayotte when asked what was wrong, despite the fact that none of the 3 sources cited for that statement contain this information. What the sources do tell us is that Maura had been speaking to her older sister Kathleen earlier during her shift, though at the time, nobody knew what that call was about. Recognizing that whatever it was probably more important than staying at her desk, Karen comforted Maura before escorting her back to her room in Kennedy Hall. Whatever was bothering Maura, the Whitman-Hanson Express reported in June of 2007, she did not share it with her friends or her father, who visited her at UMass the next day on Saturday, February 7th. And I do want to give a huge shout out here to Maribeth Conway of the Whitman-Hanson Express for an absolutely phenomenal article, series of articles really, that she wrote on this case and which helped me to form the framework of this series. Now, Fred Murray had always doted on his youngest daughter, coaching her youth sports teams, attending high school track meets, taking her on camping trips in the mountains of New Hampshire, and on that weekend, he was looking to set her up with a more reliable vehicle. Her 1996 Saturn was on its last legs, with just 3 of its engine's 4 cylinders operational, and Fred wasn't comfortable with her driving it any longer. After a long day of scouting out the local dealers, they settled on a 3-year-old Geo Prism, which is a car I have never heard of before this exact moment of writing the script, and with that objective squared away, they headed off for dinner with Maura's friend Kate Markopoulos. The father and daughter pair had a tradition of trying out a new brew pub every time Dad visited, and this time they ended up at the Amherst Brewing Company on North Pleasant Street. After dinner, Maura had plans to attend a small dorm party on campus, and for unknown reasons, Fred offered to let Maura drive his new Toyota Corolla for the night, despite the fact that she wasn't really planning to go anywhere. Regardless, Maura took him up on the offer and drove him back to the Quality Inn on Russell Street in nearby Hadley before returning to campus around 10:30 p.m. She spent the next 4 hours with Kate and a few other friends, drinking sky blue malts and wine until about 2:30 in the morning. At that point, Maura made a decision that her friends would later say struck them as odd. She wanted to return her father's car. They tried to talk her out of this, and ultimately she told them that she planned to just walk home to Kennedy Hall, but instead she went to get the car and began making her way to Hadley. She was on her way there when, around 3:30 a.m., she crashed into either a post or a guardrail, causing $8,000 to $10,000 worth of damage to the Corolla. Surprisingly, despite Maura's intoxicated state, no field sobriety or breathalyzer tests were conducted, and no charges were filed as a result of the crash. Police then gave Maura a ride to her father's hotel, where the shaken-up and extremely apologetic 21-year-old informed her dad of what had happened. Fred, to his credit, handled the situation with care, later telling the Whitman-Hanson Express that if this is the only trouble a kid ever causes, then you're pretty lucky as a parent. Then, shortly after arriving back at the Quality Inn, Maura borrowed Fred's cell phone and called her boyfriend, U.S. Army Captain Billy Roche, who at the time was a lieutenant stationed at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. By all accounts, their conversation went as it should have, with Billy consoling the young woman that he and everyone else expected he would one day marry. Fred and Maura spent the rest of that morning, Sunday, February 8th, on the phone with his insurance company. They confirmed that they would cover the damages, and that seems to have settled the matter as far as Fred was concerned. Maura agreed to fill out the proper accident report forms with the police, and Fred rented a car in order to attend a business obligation in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He made sure to call his daughter later that evening, around 11:30 p.m., to remind her to pick up the forms in the morning, and she said that she'd give him a call around 8 p.m. the next day to go over the paperwork with him. As far as anyone could tell, the situation was handled, and everything should have been resolved without issue. But for some reason, Maura proceeded to make a series of strange and, to this day, unexplained decisions. Late that night, shortly after her conversation with her father, Maura jumped onto MapQuest to search for routes to Burlington, Vermont, and the Berkshires of western Massachusetts. And after this, she seems to have gone to bed. Hours later, shortly before 1 o'clock p.m., she called Dominic and Linda Salamone, owners of a condo in Bartlett, New Hampshire, where she and her family had stayed on prior occasions. Now, the precise details of that conversation are unknown, but Maura did not end up renting from them. What we do know is that that call lasted approximately 3 minutes, and then at 1 o'clock p.m. on the dot, she emailed Billy. Her message to him read, "I love you more, stud. I got your messages, but honestly, I didn't feel like talking to much of anyone. I promised to call today, though. Love you, Maura," which would suggest that he had tried to check in on her at some point after their call on Sunday morning. Whatever the case, the next call Maura made was to a fellow nursing student, and once again, the details of that conversation are unclear. Not long after finishing that call, Maura sent an email to her professors and her supervisor at work, informing them that there had been a death in her family and that she would be taking a week off to deal with the situation. But this was a lie, as nobody on either side of Maura's family had passed away. Maura's next known action came at 2:05 p.m. when she contacted 1-800-GO-STOW, a line which connected travelers with hotels in the area of Stowe, Vermont. Once again, she made no reservations, and as would be expected, nobody thought to record the specifics of her request. She finally called Billy at 2:18 p.m., but he didn't pick up, and so she left a message promising to talk to him later. A little over an hour after that, at 3:30, Maura got into her barely drivable Saturn and drove to a nearby ATM, where a security camera recorded her as she took out $280 in cash, which was most of the money in her account. She then stopped at a liquor store and spent $40 of that money on alcohol, including bottles of Bailey's Irish Cream, Kahlua coffee liqueur, vodka, and a box of wine, and then she left Amherst. Several hours later, at 7:27 p.m. on February 9, 2004, the Grafton County Sheriff's Department received a call from the Westman residence at 70 Wild Ammonoosuc Road, outside of Haverhill, New Hampshire. On the other end of the line was Faith Westman, reporting that there had been some kind of accident outside of her rural home. After hearing a loud thump around 7 p.m., she looked out her window to see a black sedan stuck in a ditch a short distance away, facing westbound off the eastbound side of the road. When dispatcher Rhonda Marcia pressed for more information, Faith told her that she couldn't tell if anyone looked hurt, but she could see a man in the vehicle smoking a cigarette. The operator then contacted the Haverhill Police Department, who sent Sergeant Cecil Smith out to the scene. Before he could arrive, however, the Grafton County Sheriff's Department received a second call about the same vehicle. That call came in from school bus driver Butch Atwood, who lived just a little ways further down the road at 4 Wild Ammonoosuc, and he too reported seeing the black sedan. In fact, he'd done more than just see it. He'd actually stopped and had spoken to the young woman standing nearby. She had long dark hair, worn down, and appeared to be shaken up but not injured. He'd offered to call police for her, but she'd declined and told him that she'd already called AAA for roadside assistance. Atwood, who was still concerned for her well-being given the cold weather, asked if she would like to wait inside at his house, but once again, the young woman declined the offer and chose to stay with her car. So, having exhausted his options, the bus driver drove the last 100 yards or so back to his house, but at that point it occurred to him that it was very unlikely anyone could contact AAA, given the sparse cell coverage in the area, hence why he then called the police for assistance. Now, it wasn't that Butch Atwood thought the girl was up to anything nefarious, but rather that his tall, heavy-set frame at 350 pounds might have intimidated her, and she might be willing to trust a uniformed officer more than she would trust a complete stranger. But when Sergeant Smith arrived at the scene just a few minutes after Atwood called in his report, the girl was nowhere to be seen. Maura Murray had vanished into thin air. Fred Murray learned of his daughter's disappearance approximately 22 hours after she was last seen by Butch Atwood. He was still in Bridgeport when Kathleen, Maura's elder sister, called with the news. Fred immediately called the Haverhill Police Department and pleaded with them to immediately begin searching for his youngest daughter, only to be told that the New Hampshire Fish and Game Service could begin a search the following day if Maura still hadn't turned up by then, despite the fact that temperatures were well below freezing at night. Completing the absolute bare minimum of their responsibilities, the department agreed to immediately list Maura as a missing person at 5:17 p.m. on Tuesday, February 10, 2004. To be fair, they hadn't completely wasted their time since finding her car abandoned on the side of the road. When Sergeant Smith arrived on the scene the night prior, he'd done a cursory search of the area. He later reported that evidence at the scene indicated the vehicle had been eastbound and had gone off the roadway, struck some trees, spun around, and come to rest facing the wrong way in the eastbound lane. Strangely, a rag from the car's emergency kit was stuffed into the vehicle's tailpipe, and while that could have caused the vehicle to stall if it were jammed tight enough, it would not have caused the car to careen off the road and strike a tree as it had. Inside the sedan, he'd found a box of Franzia wine behind the driver's seat of the vehicle and a red liquid on the driver's side door and ceiling of the car, as well as a Coke bottle that contained a red liquid with a strong alcoholic odor. The box of wine had been damaged, potentially in the crash, but the more interesting part was the fact that none of the other bottles of alcohol that Maura had bought in Amherst were found in the car. Adding to the intrigue, the Whitman-Hanson Express reported that other items found in Maura's car were a AAA card, insurance forms, gloves, compact discs, makeup, computer-generated directions for Burlington and Stowe, Vermont, and a book Maura had been reading by Nicholas Howe, Not Without Peril, as well as clothes, toiletries, textbooks, and even birth control pills. And according to Brianna Maitland PI Greg Overacker, who got his information on this from Maura's other older sister Julie, Maura had also packed running shoes, workout clothes, the blank accident report forms, and even several pieces of diamond jewelry. As Sergeant Smith conducted his search, EMS and the local fire department arrived on scene. The paramedics didn't stay long, as they had nobody to treat and were needed elsewhere, but the firemen stuck around to secure the site and look for any sign of Maura. Meanwhile, Smith drove down to Atwood's house, where he found the man sitting inside of his bus. Smith reportedly tapped on the window and asked where the girl was, only for Atwood to say that he hadn't seen anything since leaving the abandoned sedan. So the two men decided it would be best to just drive the area in search of the missing woman. Smith reportedly headed west along Wild Ammonoosuc, also known as Route 112, while Atwood would later tell the Caledonian Record that he took a ride around the back roads for about 15 minutes, and then drove to French Pond. The Express clarified that Atwood's route took him in a loop from Mountain Lakes, a nearby recreational and residential area, to the Swiftwater Stage Shop General Store, but it's unclear if anyone drove eastbound on Wild Ammonoosuc. Whatever the case, neither man saw any sign of Maura, and at 9:27 p.m., Sergeant Smith received a call dispatching him to a more immediate, yet unrelated problem on Limekiln Road in North Haverhill. The fire department was already gone by that point, and the Saturn had been towed to Lavoie's Auto Care Center on Route 10 in Haverhill. With that, the first night of the investigation, unofficial as it was at the time, came to an end, though there are some discrepancies regarding what exactly happened that night. According to the Whitman-Hanson Express, Faith Westman and Butch Atwood were not the only people to see Maura that night. According to the Express's 2007 series of articles entitled Maura is Missing, the Murat family were also home at the time, and they told the Express, "From our kitchen window, we saw a car down the road with trouble lights flashing and someone walking around the car." John Murat believed that he'd seen the car back up parallel to the road at one point, though the Caledonian Record reported on Friday, February 20th, 2004, that due to the crash, the car's radiator was pushed back into the fan, making the vehicle inoperable. Though it should be said that given the design of that model of car, it is possible that that specific kind of damage would not have prevented it from moving short distances for a short while afterwards. And because I'm not really a car person, I'm gonna let Thornbury explain that to you.
From what I could find online of the car, the engine in that model was not how you would normally expect an engine to be sat in an engine bay. Normally you think of an engine kind of being front to back, but in smaller cars with smaller engines, sometimes they'll be actually sideways in the engine bay. So in a lot of older cars, you would have the fan for the radiator be directly connected on the front to back engine as a form of flywheel. Well, on these sideways facing engine cars, that's not possible. They have their own flywheel, they have their own mechanism for keeping time, and the radiator fan is a totally separate mechanism. In this car, it was an electric radiator driven by a motor, and so at that point, if the radiator and the fan were completely damaged and completely inoperable, basically totaled, that doesn't necessarily mean that the engine itself was totaled, and that doesn't mean that the car would be inoperable. It's very likely, especially under these conditions, that the car would still have been able to be moved under its own power. It's just that for long distances, it would not have been able to appropriately cool itself, potentially overheated, and then caused irreparable damage. Now that's assuming that the engine was still in good condition, and that the reporting on the radiator and the radiator fan was incomplete. So it may be the case that the entire front of the car was totaled, but based on the images that we see from the car, that's unlikely, so it is possible that it was capable of being moved around still.
He spoke well, and thus he shall live another day. Anyway, there was also the claim from Faith Westman that she'd seen a man smoking a cigarette in the car, which Maura's friends and family thought was odd for a number of reasons. First of all, Maura was a woman, and second of all, she despised smoking. There was the possibility that someone else was in the car with her, but Faith's husband Tim argued his wife was simply mistaken. To him, it appeared there was a young woman using a cell phone, and that the red light Faith believed was a cigarette was in reality a light from the device. Perhaps most intriguing of the observations, the Express reported that after Atwood drove away, Faith Westman noticed the Saturn's interior light switch on and off, and witnessed a flurry of activity at the rear of the car, including a person standing at the trunk. An item of information which came from private investigator John Smith, who spoke with the Westmans after the incident. Now, Butch Atwood got the closest look of any of the witnesses, and his story was reported in a couple of different ways. Atwood himself said that when he arrived, Maura struggled to get out of her Saturn because the door was hitting against a snowbank. Regarding Maura's physical appearance, he told the Caledonian Record that he saw no blood and that she was cold and shivering. The disparity in storytelling, though minor, came with the conversation that the two had. Atwood told the press that he'd stepped out of the bus to ask Maura if she wanted him to call the police, and that she'd told him not to bother because she'd already called AAA. It would later be confirmed that his hunch about her not being able to do that was correct, and that Maura had in fact not called AAA. But the important part is how this differs from the description given by New Hampshire State Police Lieutenant John Scarinza later that year. According to a synopsis of the case which he authored, when Atwood stated that he was going to call local law enforcement to come assist, Maura pleaded with him not to call police, a statement which carries quite a bit of subtext. You see, from the night of the crash, police seem to have been skeptical of Maura's sobriety. Sergeant Smith mentioned the box of wine and the Coke bottle with an alcoholic smell, while Scarinza's words could be interpreted as an implication that Maura was deliberately avoiding contact with the police. And this may have colored their decision not to pursue a search on the 10th, and to delay any further efforts until the 11th when Fred asked them to launch a search immediately. Atwood, for his part, told reporters that Maura had not appeared intoxicated when he spoke to her, and in one more fit of initial incompetence, the Haverhill Police Department issued a bolo for Maura Murray in which they inaccurately described her as being 5 foot 3 inches tall with black hair that reached down just below her shoulders. In reality, Maura was 5'7", with brown hair that reached only to her shoulders, and which she typically wore in a bun. It would not be the last time that a decision made by that department caused difficulties in the case, and Fred Murray would battle the system repeatedly in the coming months. Maura's father, for his part, got involved in the case as soon as he could, arriving in Haverhill early the morning of the 11th to take part in the search. It was just before dawn when he pulled into the modest parking lot of the Haverhill Police Department, which ran out of the small town's sole administrative building along Dartmouth College Highway. With a population of just 4,500 people, Haverhill fields a small law enforcement force of just 4 patrol officers and 1 detective, so they weren't exactly equipped to run a large-scale missing persons search. If Maura was going to be found, it would require more than just the efforts of those few uniforms and Fred Murray. Thankfully, the call was answered, not just by Maura's loved ones, but also by the New Hampshire State Police, Fish and Game, and a canine unit, and it began to look like there was a chance of finding her before it was too late. As the search effort kicked into gear on that cold Wednesday morning, law enforcement split duties with the volunteers. The dog team was deployed directly to the crash site to see if their animals could pick up a scent trail, while Fred Murray scanned the ground around the scene for any sign of footprints. Overhead, a Fish and Game helicopter did the same from the air, hoping that the lack of snow since Monday night would have preserved whatever path she might have taken through the 2.5-foot deep drifts. Meanwhile, those of Maura's siblings who were within driving distance, those being Kathleen, her older brother Freddie, and her younger brother Curtis, were already surveying the various tourist towns nestled throughout the area, many of which had served as vacation homes for their family over the years. They stopped into motels and restaurants in towns like North Woodstock and Lincoln, and traveled as far east as Bartlett and Conway, but nobody had seen hide nor hair of the missing nursing student, and there wasn't much success on the law enforcement side either. Both the helicopter and the ground team failed to find any human tracks in the vicinity of the crash. The dog team briefly tracked a scent from one of Maura's gloves, but as so often happens, the dog lost it some 100 yards down the road, east of the crash site. According to the Express, the abrupt loss of Maura's scent in the middle of the road prompted officials to speculate that Maura got into a passing vehicle, though whether she did so voluntarily or was forced remains open to question. With the sunlight dwindling and little progress made, the search teams reported back to the Haverhill Police Department around 5:00 p.m. to regroup. It was around this time that Billy Roche and his parents arrived. The Army lieutenant had requested leave from Fort Sill when he learned of Maura's disappearance, and police were quick to put him into an interrogation room. They questioned him for a while in private, and then again with parents Sharon and Bill, before allowing all 3 of them to join the effort. And as it turned out, Billy hadn't just brought himself. He'd also brought a potential lead in the form of a voicemail left while he was traveling from Oklahoma. According to Sharon Roche, the message was very short and consisted of a shivering, soft whimpering sound with labored breathing as if someone was very cold. Immediately upon learning of that call, everyone had the same question. Could it have been Maura? Answering that question, however, was going to be more difficult than they might have hoped. First of all, the call had not come from Maura's cell phone, or any cell phone for that matter. Instead, it traced to a prepaid AT&T calling card, potentially one of 2 that Sharon had purchased for Maura the previous Thanksgiving. Now, for those too young to remember, which honestly includes me, the way these cards would work is that you would go to a public phone and you would dial a number that would connect you to, I guess, the operator. You'd then type in a PIN and then type in the number you wish to call, and that was how it charged your card. The problem was that identifying what kind of calling card it had come from was where the ability to trace the call ended, at least according to the family. New Hampshire State Police would eventually conclude that the call traced to the American Red Cross, but Sharon Roche has roundly disputed that claim. Speaking directly to the Express in 2007, she told a reporter that she could say with certainty that, contrary to New Hampshire State Police info, the call could not be traced, because they lacked the PIN and card number associated with that card. It just doesn't make any sense that the call was from the Red Cross, she continued, because if they had been trying to call Billy, they never called back. Furthermore, she noted that the soft crying, sniffling, and muffled sobs couldn't logically be connected with the Red Cross either. But the state police, that didn't matter. As far as they were concerned, the call came from the Red Cross, and that meant it wasn't relevant to the disappearance. As far as the events of the 11th went, however, the search had made little progress. The only lead they had was the abrupt drop-off of the scent trail along the road, and so they focused their efforts on the possibility that she may have gotten into a car with someone. Still, that didn't explain why she'd come to New Hampshire in the first place, and that was a rather important factor in the case. By the end of the search day, the Haverhill police speculated that Maura planned to end her own life or had planned to run away, citing their belief that there was no evidence of foul play or that Maura had wandered into the woods. Already working to bring an end to the search, Haverhill Police Chief Jeff Williams asserted that, at the age of 21, Maura was within her legal rights to not want to be found. Maura's loved ones, on the other hand, vehemently disagreed. Sharon Rosh later told reporters, "I cannot believe that there would be any problem in her life that would cause her to run away from three close groups of people in her life. Her family, Billy and his family, and the very close-knit group of Hanson High School girlfriends." Fred Murray held the same opinion, unable to recall any pattern of behavior or traumatic events which might have led his daughter to do such a thing. The only thing that came to mind was the car crash a few nights prior, but Maura had essentially walked away from that without any consequences. And I didn't put it in the script, but it also occurs to me now that the things she brought with her do not suggest she had any plans of harming herself. You don't bring diamond earrings and birth control pills and your textbooks if you plan on leaving this world behind. And as everybody in her life agreed, there didn't seem to be a reason for her to leave her life behind either. Anyway, with that, the first day of the search came to a close, and the Murray camp retreated to the Wells River Motel in Vermont, just across the Connecticut River from Woodsville, New Hampshire. The modest, cozy refuge, as described by the Whitman-Hanson Express, would become their home for the foreseeable future, and the next morning they headed back out to Haverhill for day 2 of the search. Thursday the 12th saw the beginning of media involvement in the case, as police issued a press release stating that Maura may be en route to the Kankamegas Highway area and was listed as endangered and possibly a danger to herself. Additionally, the release stated that witnesses at the scene reported seeing a lone female with no apparent injuries who appeared impaired due to alcohol consumption. And this claim appeared in spite of the fact that the only witness to speak with Maura, that being Butch Atwood, had described her as not appearing intoxicated or otherwise impaired. Yet another link in a chain of questionable actions made by the Haverhill Police Department during the most crucial phase of the investigation and search effort. As the family wrestled with law enforcement in New Hampshire, another search was underway back in Amherst. UMass and Amherst police, who just months earlier had searched Maura's room for that stolen credit card number, were now combing through her dorm for any evidence that might explain why she'd left, where she'd been trying to go, and what she intended to do when she got there. It was during this time that certain details first came to light, such as Maura's lie about a death in the family, her ATM withdrawal, and her liquor store purchase, as well as her breakdown at work a week prior, and some details suggesting that she might have either packed up her room or had not yet unpacked after getting back from winter break. Kathleen Murray would tell police that she and Maura had spoken on the phone on that evening of February the 5th around 10:30 p.m., but that their conversation was regular, just trying to get through the day kind of stuff, and that when she heard Maura had been crying later that night, she couldn't understand what about their conversation might have caused that kind of a response. Back in New Hampshire, the two most important men in Maura's life met with reporters for a press conference in Bethlehem, New Hampshire. According to the Express, Fred used this opportunity to speak directly to his daughter, just in case she had run away on purpose and might be listening to the news. "I don't know what the matter is, or the trouble you think you might be in, but it isn't anything we can't solve," he said through the media. "It's me. You can tell me. We'll work it out until we solve it." Then, Billy informed the press of something that really leaves me stunned as a historian of missing persons cases. Police were already suspending the search. There had been no evidence that Maura had disappeared from that crash site intentionally. She had left no notes, and had packed books, clothes, and even jewelry. And even if she planned to run away from Amherst, that didn't mean she'd chosen to leave the crash site on foot, or that she wasn't in danger as a result. Furthermore, neither her credit and debit cards nor her cell phone had been used since Monday, meaning that for all anyone knew, she could still be lost outdoors. And that degree of incompetence was about to get so very much worse. Maura's family wasn't willing to throw in the towel just because the Haverhill police were. And on Friday, they began calling and visiting with police stations across the river in Vermont. Maura had printed out directions to two of that state's towns, Burlington and Stowe, so it only seemed reasonable that she might have tried to continue on to one of those places after crashing her car. When Fred contacted Vermont police, however, he learned that they didn't know anything about Maura. Not only had the Haverhill police failed to extend their bolo to departments just across the river, in the very state where her MapQuest directions suggested she was going, but they had also neglected to inform any of the departments to their east along Route 112. And as soon as Fred Murray learned of these failures, whatever faith remained in the Haverhill officers was shattered, and his efforts became far more direct. In the week following the suspension of the official search, the Murrays and their friends hit the ground harder than anyone had in the first few days. They knocked on doors, made telephone calls, and spoke with residents, the Express reported, including those who had called 911. Fred and Billy went on CNN to speak with Soledad O'Brien, describing her actions that Monday as completely out of character, and noting that she follows through on what she says she's going to do, referring to her stated plans to call both her father and her boyfriend on that fateful evening. With permission from property owners, Fred himself trudged through snow, brush, and debris, leaving no stone unturned as he battled the elements in search of any sign of his missing daughter. And in the course of doing so, he uncovered yet another shocking oversight by the Haverhill police. Aside from the witnesses they'd spoken to on the night of Maura's accident, they hadn't interviewed a soul who lived on Wild Amanuset Road. Fred read them the riot act on the 18th, and as a result, the state police, along with Fish and Game, hit the ground once more to perform a second search the next day. This time they brought 3 dogs, while the helicopter team conducted a more wide-ranging scan of a 2-mile radius around the crash site. Ground crews checked trails and roadways all over the area, but their efforts still turned up nothing. The good news, at least in a way, was that the state police were taking it a little bit more seriously than the locals had. While they didn't list Maura's case as a criminal investigation, Sergeant Tom York told reporters that the term was just a label and that police would be treating the case much as they could a criminal investigation. What he meant was that they were actively collecting background information, looking into leads, and trying to piece together what could have happened that night if Maura hadn't intended to disappear. Sadly, they found nothing, and once again, authorities made the decision to suspend their efforts, albeit with considerably more reason to do so than the first time around. There was a brief glimmer of hope on the 26th, when Kathleen Murray found a pair of women's underwear in the snow near French Pond, but the DNA testing needed to determine if they belonged to Maura would take 2 weeks to come back. The Murrays were exhausted, their friends needed to get back to work, and there was nothing else they could do except to wait. So, on March 2nd, they checked out of the Wells River Motel and headed back to Massachusetts. 17 days later, Brianna Maitland's car was found crashed into the side of a barn off of a rural Vermont highway, and questions about a potential serial killer began to mount. For Fred Murray, March of 2004 was a difficult month. He spent every weekend in the Haverhill area, desperately searching for any leads which might breathe life into his daughter's case. And as that month wound to a close, the eerily similar details of Brianna Maitland's disappearance just over 60 miles away in Vermont were beginning to make their way into the media. Like his own daughter, Brianna was a young and attractive brunette who disappeared from a rural highway after crashing her car on the wrong side of the road. Both girls had vanished without leaving any scent trail or footprints, and multiple witnesses passed by the cars without reporting anything to law enforcement. Neither Brianna nor Maura were present when police arrived on scene, and authorities towed both cars before a proper investigation of the area could be completed. But early in April, both the Vermont and New Hampshire State Police came together to issue a release stating that there was no connection between the two cases. Also early in April, on the 2nd, Fred Murray received a notice from the Haverhill Police Department. According to the Caledonian Record, Chief of Police Jeff Williams sent the determined father a letter informing him that his department had received a written request from area residents about repeated trespassing and parking problems on their properties, and explaining that, while they are sympathetic with the cause to find Maura, the right to quiet enjoyment of their personal property has been repeatedly and blatantly disregarded to the point that they now must insist that absolutely no one has permission to trespass on their properties. According to Williams, this was an order that Murray family members, friends, and relatives of Maura Murray, volunteer searches and canine handlers, private investigators, members of the press, and anyone else seeking clues or searching for Maura Murray were to stay off of private property or face arrest by his department. This letter came as a shock to the entire Murray camp. They had been asking for permission during all of their searches, and nobody had said a word to them in the month and a half since they'd begun their efforts. Sharon Rosh, the mother of Maura's boyfriend Billy, found the decision to send a letter rather than make a phone call offensive and callous, while Fred himself believed that the police had ulterior motives. So far, they hadn't looked great, and it was his opinion that the true intent of Williams' letter was that the police were trying to discourage any independent searches for Maura, and that it was an attempt to reduce the amount of publicity Maura's disappearance had been receiving. That opinion was bolstered shortly after the story made its way into the press on April 14th, because a week later on the 20th, another article came out regarding the issue of trespassing. In an article entitled "Residents Dispute Claims They Want Trespassers Arrested," the Caledonian Record reported that people living in the area where a 21-year-old University of Massachusetts at Amherst student went missing dispute police claims they filed complaints regarding the woman's father, relatives, and searchers. When asked by the Record, Chief Williams refused to say how many complaints were actually filed, or who had filed them, while Steve Loud of nearby McGuire Lane argued it's just the people down by the barn. The people down by the barn were the Westmans, who had admitted to the Record that they had indeed filed a complaint and that the Murrays had never consulted them about checking their property. After 2 months, what are they looking for? Faith Westman asked. Have we not covered enough? As far as the Murrays and most of the Westmans' neighbors were concerned, the answer was no. Steve Loud told the paper that claims the neighbors living near the accident site had gathered together to file complaints with the Haverhill Police Department were not true, and that anyone looking for Maura was welcome to search his property. John Boutillier echoed that sentiment, telling the paper that he didn't care if people came on his land and recognized that this was a stressful situation for Fred Murray. It makes you wonder if someone has something to hide, he added. Whether or not that was the case, the family felt that the local police and the New Hampshire State Police were either unwilling or unequipped to handle Maura's case, and at this point, they needed the assistance of the FBI if anything was to come of the search. And as it turned out, the FBI had already offered to join the hunt back in mid-February, only to be told that their offer was appreciated, but not necessary. The Murrays strongly disagreed, so on April 29th, Fred held a press conference at the Woodsville American Legion Hall in concert with Bruce and Kelly Maitland. Also present were the parents of Amy Riley, a 20-year-old woman whose body was found in a swamp earlier that month. Amy went missing in August of 2003 after leaving a bar in Manchester, New Hampshire, and despite the arguments from police that there was no connection between the 3 cases, all 3 families felt that the similarities between the disappearances and the fact that they crossed state lines warranted FBI assistance. As April turned into May, and May neared June, Fred Murray turned to the only authority with a chance to turn things around: the governor of New Hampshire. With the FBI unable to step in until they were either invited or until an official connection was made between the Vermont and New Hampshire disappearances, he wanted Governor Craig Benson to force the state police to bring the FBI in. The finest resource in the world is available, and you, sir, should direct Lieutenant John Scarinza and Troop F to accept its offer, Fred wrote, adding that there are corollary cases in Vermont also, and this entire situation begs for central coordination and investigation by an agency which is not bound by the confines of configuration of Grafton County and the Connecticut River. Lieutenant Scarinza, who was in charge of the state police effort, for his part disagreed. Acknowledging that the FBI was involved in the case on the Massachusetts side, he argued that the state police had enough resources to conduct the investigation without federal assistance, something that had not, to that point, proven to be the case. At every turn, New Hampshire authorities had at best failed to execute on their responsibilities, and at worst had stood in the way of any further efforts by volunteers. Murray drew Benson's attention to these facts as well, arguing that state police and Haverhill police had been grossly negligent because a cruiser was not dispatched east along Route 112 to help find his daughter after her accident. Police had arrived just minutes after Maura was last seen by a witness, meaning that she couldn't have gotten particularly far and was likely just up the road when Sergeant Smith got to the scene. And Fred Murray was not without reason to believe this was the case. Along with the direction of the scent trail found by the dogs, he had received word the day of that April 29th press conference that someone had seen Maura heading eastbound along that same road. That witness was named Rick Forcier, and he'd contacted Mr. Murray when he realized that he might have seen Maura on the night of her disappearance. He had been driving home from a contracting job in Franconia that night, and he recalled seeing a young woman matching her description running along Route 112, about 4 or 5 miles east of the scene of her accident. Police, as it happened, had already interviewed Forcier on February 19th, but at that time Forcier said nothing about this sighting, apparently because he thought it had occurred 2 days after she disappeared. He told Fred Murray, however, that upon reviewing his records, he realized that he'd mixed up his dates during that first interview. If he had seen a young woman that night, it could have meant that Maura could have been recovered if someone had just bothered to drive east. She was figuratively and nearly literally right there, Murray's letter to the governor continued, readily available to be rescued and saved from whatever fate has befallen her. All that the police had to do was expend minimal mental and physical effort. The onus of this irresponsible and possibly fatal lack of action lies not only with the North Haverhill force, but also with the New Hampshire State Police, who responded to the 911 calls from the neighbors as well. As of the time the Caledonian Record published that article, Governor Benson's office stated that they'd yet to receive the letter. But according to Murray, the Postal Service tracking system showed that it had been delivered the day before they made that statement. Whether it was incompetence or deliberate neglect, Authorities were failing it every step of the way, and Murray was growing tired of it. Whether the governor's office received this letter or not, their answer came in some form through their silence, and through a joint announcement by the Vermont and New Hampshire State Police Bureaus on June 8, 2004. After a day-long meeting with the FBI Tuesday, the Caledonian Record reported, the state-level agencies told the press that there was no connection between the disappearances. In a move that would infuriate both the Murray and the Maitland families, law enforcement then stated that Maitland had made several bad life choices before she disappeared, and at one point had been a runaway, while Murray had nearly cleaned out her bank account, packed up her belongings in her dorm room at UMass Amherst, and made off for destinations unknown. Both statements lacked the considerable nuance involved in both cases, and were clear attempts to blame the two missing women for whatever had happened to them. In reality, both cases involved total failures of procedure by the responding officers. Now, Brianna Maitland had made poor decisions in her life. There's no argument to be made about that. However, she wasn't making those decisions on the night she disappeared. She had just left work and was heading home to get some sleep before an early morning shift at her second job. Her car was discovered by police the following day, but rather than report the abandoned vehicle, which showed clear signs of distress on the part of the driver, and investigate the situation, the responding state trooper had the car towed and then went on a long weekend vacation without breathing a word of it to anyone else in the office. Maura's case wasn't quite so egregious, but the fact that the responding officer chose to drive back the way he came to look for her, rather than checking the route he hadn't already followed, made the Haverhill PD and the New Hampshire State Police look horribly unprofessional, considering that a state trooper had arrived on scene just moments after the police did. Furthermore, in both cases, the vehicle was towed before an actual CSI team could arrive on site. And thanks to these failures, the investigations lost valuable time at crucially important moments, and destroyed the scenes in the process. In response to the statements, Bruce Maitland pointed out that the authorities didn't have any evidence saying they aren't connected, and that the claims were almost character assassinations of the victims. He felt that the police were prematurely attempting to close both investigations by pitting the disappearances on runaway adults who didn't want to be found, and it's not hard to see why. Whatever the case, the Murray investigation changed directions soon after, when New Hampshire State Police showed up with a request for Maura's personal belongings. They had originally been returned to the family when the search was suspended in February, but as June rolled into July, something drove the police to seek a forensic examination of the items from Maura's car and dorm room. Along with what had been found in the car, they also confiscated her hard drive and the car itself, explaining that the state's Major Crimes Division was stepping in to oversee the case from that point on. Fred Murray wasn't pleased that they were only now taking over, but Lieutenant Scarinza made a point of telling the papers that major crimes weren't just stepping in for the first time. According to the Caledonian, he was emphatic that the items were not only now being looked at, and that major crimes had been involved in the Murray disappearance since 3 days after she disappeared. On the other hand, the paper reported that when asked whether any of the items, including clothing and books, had been analyzed for forensic evidence in the beginning of the investigation, he replied that you don't just send a bag of stuff down there. It seems he chose his language precisely because the items were certainly looked at when they were inventoried by the police. They just weren't properly examined by a forensics team. What they did know, based on the very limited scope of their investigation, was that something was missing from the car. In addition to the missing bottles of Bailey's, Kahlua, and vodka, Maura's black JanSport backpack had also disappeared, along with her cell phone and wallet. To police, this suggested that she left the scene of the accident voluntarily. If she did, they thought it might have something to do with the book Not Without Peril by Nicholas Howe, written about tragedies in the White Mountains, which was found in the back seat. And while explaining that they plan to hold all items for potential evidence later on, Scarinza said, for instance, is there something significant about the book? I don't know. I don't know seems like it could be the slogan for the Maura Murray investigation, but there are reasons to believe that the investigators knew more than they were letting on. Not least among them was the refusal to accept potential evidence even when it was literally being handed to them. On one occasion in late 2004, Fred Murray went to state police headquarters with a stained rusty jackknife, which he'd received from a man who believed his own brother might be connected to the disappearance. However, when Fred tried to hand it over, he reportedly did not get beyond the plate glass window. According to the Whitman-Hanson Express, Fred recalled telling the dispatcher, "I have what could be evidence in a capital crime. only to be told that no one was available at headquarters to accept such evidence. Instead, he was told to come back during regular work hours, though he opted to mail the evidence instead, along with a full explanation of how he'd come to possess it. Given that Fred Murray did not live in central New Hampshire, this is a reasonable thing to do. And the police indeed confirmed receipt of the package, but they never reached out about it. If that weren't enough, late 2004 also saw yet another revelation about the total incompetence of the investigation. Unwilling to give up just because the police had, the Murrays and Roshes had continued the search on their own, and that led them to reach out to Dominic and Linda Salamone in Bartlett, New Hampshire. Maura had called them on the day she disappeared, ostensibly to inquire about renting their condo, and the families hoped the couple might have some information regarding what Maura's plans were on that fateful day. But when Sharon Rosh called them in October, she was shocked to learn that she was the first person to reach out to them about the disappearance. Despite being some of the last people to speak to Maura on the day she went missing, police had never bothered to interview them. "It blew our minds," Sharon told the Patriot Ledger, "that it's now 8 months later and we're finding out the police never even called these people." As the revelations of investigative inadequacy mounted, the Murrays reached a breaking point in their relationship with law enforcement, and they abandoned any hope that the authorities would do the right thing. But Fred made one final appeal to the new governor, John Lynch, on the first anniversary of his daughter's disappearance. On February 9, 2005, he headed to Concord, New Hampshire in the hope of meeting with the new executive. He was only able to speak with the governor for about 10 minutes, but Fred had planned for that sort of outcome. As a backup, he'd written a letter explaining what had happened and why he needed assistance, and unlike last time, he made sure to hand it directly to the man who most needed to read it. In that letter, Fred Murray excoriated the astonishingly careless, go-through-the-motions response of the New Hampshire State Police, as well as their unnaturally steadfast refusal to communicate on the matter since. He outlined their failures in detail, including not questioning neighbors who live 100 yards from and in sight of the accident scene until 10 days had passed, and the fact that they only did so because the Murrays demanded it after calling those people themselves. Not even the fact that their tracking dog lost Maura's scent squarely before these properties, one of which was owned by the last person who talked to Maura, and another by the last person to actually see her, he wrote in a fury, was enough to provoke the most elementary of basic investigatory technique. Fred pulled no punches regarding his beliefs about the reality of the situation, writing that law enforcement's decision on this case from its inception has been to insist that you can take your pick of 3 possible happenstances: self-delete for the purpose of YouTube, runaway or hypothermia victim, but not consider the 4th, which is the probability rather than the possibility, that is, that a bad guy grabbed her and they can't catch him. Beyond basic incompetence, Fred Murray even accused the state police of deliberately misleading the public, explaining how, in order to support their diversion, the commander of Troop F twice stated during a television appearance in Boston that Maura wrote a final letter to her boyfriend and left it in a prominent place in her dormitory room. As far as Fred was concerned, this was an attempt to suggest the traditional goodbye letter, when in reality she never wrote or left such a letter at all, something he said police were fully cognizant of at the time. The pattern certainly doesn't indicate adherence to accepted and recommended police procedure, he continued, adding that, to date, the high law enforcement officials in Concord have reacted like ostriches to this pseudo-investigation. Finally, as a last blow to the investigators, he pointed out that their incompetence was only made worse by the fact that, even with it being so obvious that they lacked the ability to solve the case on their own, they remained determined to not accept the offer of meaningful participation extended by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He finished the letter with a plea to Governor Lynch, writing, "You represent my final hope to help my little girl. I pray you will regard reacting favorably to my entreaty not so much as your legal obligation, but as a parent, your moral responsibility." If Governor Lynch ever read the letter, then it seems he was unmoved. Though he told Fred Murray that he would look into the situation, the desperate father met with the same resistance as always when he met with New Hampshire authorities a month later. There would be no release of files, no reclassification of the case, and no acceptance of FBI assistance. Fred Murray held out hope for the remainder of the year, but when nothing changed, he had only one option left if he hoped to force some kind of movement. On December 29, 2005, he sued the involved agencies for access to their case files, arguing that if the investigation has concluded, then he should be made aware of that fact, and any records should be turned over to him so he can continue searching for information in the hopes of finding Maura. As far as he was concerned, the fact that Maura could be in danger was a compelling reason for requiring the respondents to disclose the records. The Grafton County Superior Court, located in North Haverhill, Haverhill, I had like 8 different ways of pronouncing this given to me in the comments. We have places nearby that are Haverford and Havertown. That's why I've been saying Haverhill, but I guess it's Haverhill or Haverhill. I'll go with Haverhill, try to make everybody happy. Anyway, the Grafton County Superior Court, located in North Haverhill, wasted no time in responding to this lawsuit. And on January 26, 2006, they issued their decision. They acknowledged that Murray's argument was based upon 2 suppositions: that law enforcement authorities have characterized Maura's case as a missing persons matter and not a criminal investigation, and that the investigation does not appear to be ongoing. Despite both of these suppositions being accurate to the facts, his request was categorically denied under the reasoning that the records sought by the petitioner are investigatory in nature and have been compiled for law enforcement purposes, and therefore should be exempt from disclosure because production of the records would clearly interfere with enforcement proceedings. All of this was based upon the court's claim that this was an ongoing criminal investigation in which no arrests have been made, once again despite the fact that law enforcement repeatedly refused to reclassify the case as a criminal investigation and that they were not actively investigating any leads, new or old. To add insult to injury, they argued that they came to this conclusion due to Murray's insistence that foul play had not been ruled out, rather than any official classification of the case as criminal in nature. Murray's lawyer, Timothy Irvin, found all of that preposterous, and in particular the claims about classification. They can't just, with a broad stroke, say everything's exempt, Irvin told the press. This is a missing persons case. It's not a criminal investigation. In essence, they couldn't just claim it was a missing persons case to get out of investigating, and then turn around and claim it was a criminal investigation to avoid disclosure. He further explained that somewhere in the stacks of 2,500 pages of records may be a phone number, an email address, or a name that stuck out to Maura's father in ways that would not catch the attention of the police, and that all they wanted was to add to what the police have done and see if we can find something new. Irvin then appealed the case to the New Hampshire Supreme Court, who proceeded to hand down a demand for a re-examination of the issue a few months later, and this led to an evidentiary hearing back in Grafton in April. Unfortunately, Judge Vaughn once again sided with the police, stating that even partial disclosure could reasonably be expected to interfere with law enforcement proceedings. As for what proceedings he was talking about, it was a little bit difficult to say. Despite the fact that there were no suspects in the case, New Hampshire Assistant Attorney General Jeff Streltson testified that there was a 75% likelihood of prosecution, and therefore the release of records could jeopardize their non-existent case. Fred Murray, rightfully in my opinion, felt that this was a complete charade and that the reality was simple. They didn't do what they were supposed to do, and they've been covering up ever since. If the police were looking for a way to prove that Fred was right, it came in October of that same year, when Fred received a tip about a home on Valley Road, about a mile from the scene of the accident. After obtaining permission to search the property from the real estate agent overseeing its sale, he brought in a volunteer canine team from the New Hampshire League of Investigators. According to the Express, their cadaver dog hid on the second floor, and when they brought in another set of 4 cadaver dogs the next day, they went bonkers outside of a closet on the first floor. The private volunteer search team bagged a number of items indicated by the dogs and even took a sample of the carpet, and then they turned everything over to the state police. But according to private investigator John Healy, police were not at all interested in the evidence and would not take the carpet into their possession. Now, if you look at the Wikipedia page for this case, there is an interesting conundrum. Their version of the story has an update regarding this house, which says that in April of 2019, an excavation was done in that house after ground-penetrating radar revealed something buried under the basement. However, the articles it cites for this don't seem to be about the same house referenced in the Whitman-Hanson Express and other contemporary coverage. Instead, it would seem that they're describing a second home, about which Fred received a tip early on in the case. According to a CBS News report, Fred had tried on multiple occasions to get access to this house in the years between Maura's disappearance and the article's publication in February of 2019, but the homeowners had denied him access every time. It was only after the property changed hands in 2018 that Fred was able to go in and do some digging. Considering that none of the more recent articles describing this house mention the 2006 search, that the 2018 house was described as astonishingly close to the crash site as compared to about a mile away, and that the later articles make no mention of hits upstairs, it seems possible that these are two different properties rather than two separate investigations of the Valley Road house. Either way, the tip Fred Murray received was very specific. A body had been buried in the basement shortly after Maura disappeared. In 2018, after receiving permission to do a sweep, two separate cadaver dogs hit on a spot in the basement, and ground-penetrating radar confirmed there was some sort of disturbance underneath the concrete flooring. Even for the ever-incompetent New Hampshire State Police, that kind of evidence was too much to ignore. So, in March 2019, they set out their own team of two cadaver dogs to search the basement. Jeff Streltson told Boston.com that the state police felt there was certainly no probable cause to do so, and that it was really done to just cross something off the list, which aren't statements that inspire confidence in their efforts when you really think about it. It's not totally clear what the police search involved, but CBS reported in April of 2019 that they received permission from the new homeowners to dig up a small area of concrete in the basement, and that Streltson said the private searcher's ground-penetrating radar had detected disturbed ground, not a body. Boston.com added that officials found absolutely nothing other than what appears to be a piece of pottery or old piping. With that, the lead was dismissed, at least by the police. Fred Murray, on the other hand, wasn't so sure he agreed with their assessment. It was his opinion that the police had dug in the wrong place, and that he wasn't satisfied they got anywhere close enough to the corner where the private dogs had indicated something was buried. "This one hurts because I thought we finally had it," he told CBS. "This one was worse than the other false alarms or dead ends. I was pretty sure based on what I heard and who the people were and other things I've heard about them." And that particular statement caught my attention, as did something written in the Boston.com article. Fred Murray said he believes his daughter is dead, and that the man who lived in the house at the time of the crash and his nearby extended family members were responsible. I believe I've tracked down the exact home in question, but unfortunately I've hit a dead end in identifying who owned it prior to 2018. Even if I were able to confirm that information, however, I wouldn't be able to share it for privacy reasons. Not because it would be illegal, but because it just probably wouldn't be the most appropriate thing to do. I just want to say that if I do turn out to be right about it, it will not be the first time that this has happened. But anyway, unless police agree to perform a full excavation and to finally treat this as a criminal investigation, nobody will be able to say for certain that the house holds no secrets. It has now been nearly 20 years since Jeff Streltson said there was a 75% chance of prosecution in the Maura Murray investigation, and in that time, not one suspect has been publicized. Not one piece of evidence has been uncovered. Not one example of good police work has emerged. All that has been done has been achieved by volunteers and through the sheer force of will coming from Fred Murray, who to this day maintains a belief that his daughter met with foul play. He's not alone in that belief either, even as the New Hampshire authorities and others, like author James Renner, argue for various reasons that she chose to leave of her own accord. On the other hand, there are many who agree with Fred that someone local to the crash site abducted Maura, while others have come forward with theories that she was either lured there or chosen as a target of opportunity by someone traveling through the region. And in that case, the big question is who? Brianna Maitland case PI Greg Overacker thinks he may know the answer to that, and it's one that does fit with Renner's hypothesis, at least to some extent. In our video on Brianna's case, we briefly went over Greg's theory that a serial killer may have been responsible for both the disappearances of Maura and Brianna in 2004. And while he never outright says the name of this alleged murderer, he's heavily implied that it is the same man who was convicted for the death of Michelle Gardner Quinn in October of 2006. Like Brianna, she lived in northern Vermont, where she attended UVM. And like Maura, Michelle was a 21-year-old college student who was last seen on October 7th when she went out for dinner with her parents before meeting up with friends for some drinks. After leaving the bar to head back to her residence, Overacker writes that she borrowed a phone from a stranger on the street to call a friend, someone she had gotten separated from. This man was Brian Rooney, who later answered Michelle's phone when that friend, Tommy Lang, called her back. Tommy later told reporters that Rooney said something to the effect of, "I guess you want to speak with this beautiful brunette standing next to me." As you can imagine, it did not take long for authorities to charge Brian Rooney for the murder of Michelle Gardner Quinn. Security camera footage from a jewelry store caught Brian and Michelle walking together around 2:30 that morning, and when Michelle's body was recovered from a crevice in Huntington Gorge on October 13th, he became the prime suspect. Forensic evidence, and in particular DNA analysis, linked him to the assault almost immediately, and by October 25th, he was set to stand trial. He was already in custody for another unrelated sexual offense after being arrested the same day teenage hikers found Michelle's remains, and in March of 2008, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder. His lawyer put up a valiant defense, arguing that the state's case lacked witnesses to the abduction and killing, and hinged on 2 nanograms of sperm handled by a forensic lab with a history of sloppy work. But the jury wasn't having it. The judge wasn't either, and openly referred to a teary-eyed Rooney as the lowest of the low during sentencing. He later appealed, his new lawyer arguing that there was no proof that the victim had died on the night she was assaulted, and therefore the DNA evidence could not be used to prove that Rooney was responsible for her murder. But the Vermont Supreme Court stood by the decision of the lower court. Brian Rooney is currently serving life without parole, and given his history of abuse towards not only adult women, but also young girls, that's exactly what he deserves, if not more. Aiden, for entirely unrelated purposes that, for legal reasons, have nothing to do with Brian Rooney, can you please place an image of a wood chipper on screen and make the sound, somehow, of a wood chipper? Unrelated, of course. All of that business aside, the question is, could he be responsible for the disappearances of Maura and Brianna? There are certainly a good number of commonalities between the victims, something that profilers refer to as victimology. All 3 were attractive, young, white women with dark hair. All 3 were in some form of distress when they were last seen. Maura and Brianna had just been in car accidents, and Gardner Quinn had become separated from her friends late at night. One of the most difficult parts about connecting the cases would be geography, but Rooney worked construction and traveled frequently. He'd once committed an assault in St. Johnsbury, Vermont, which is generally in the middle of the Murray, Maitland, and Quinn disappearances, and at the time of his arrest for the slaying of Gardner Quinn, he was under investigation for another attack in Caledonia County, just east of Burlington. It would appear that he lived in East Concord in 1998, and in 2006, the New York Times reported that he was living in Richmond, Vermont, not far from the Huntington Gorge. And while I've been unable to confirm it, a Reddit post also links him to the Mountain Lakes neighborhood of Woodsville, New Hampshire in 2004, which is precisely the area where Maura disappeared. Leaving aside the unconfirmed information from Reddit, Brian's familiarity with northern Vermont and the itinerant nature of his job means that the geography actually does make a lot of sense. The bigger question is how he would have met Brianna and Maura, considering they both disappeared in very rural areas compared to Michelle. Overacker has a theory for that one too, and it's not a bad one. Brianna, he suggested, may have met Rooney at one of her 2 jobs, either in Montgomery or St. Albans, Vermont. Of the 2, the St. Albans one is the more likely, mainly because she was a server there while she worked in the back as a dishwasher at the other. And while I typically don't trust books at face value, at least not without other evidence that corroborates what's in them, Overacker actually has a very good reputation as a PI and had explicit permission and even encouragement from the family when writing his book, unlike James Renner, who we'll be getting to in a moment. And I bring this up because one thing he says at the end of his work is that in the days prior to Brianna's disappearance, she had told a close friend that she'd met an older man at work. The friend seemed to believe that she was talking about the Black Lantern Inn, where she was washing dishes, but Overacker wonders if she might have been mistaken about which job Brianna was talking about. If that man were Rooney, it could be possible that she had told him about her job at the Black Lantern, and that on the night she disappeared, he was lying in wait for her. Brianna was on a predictable path home from work and had a reasonably rigid schedule if someone were looking to ambush or otherwise intercept her. Personally, I don't think that necessarily explains several of the other circumstances surrounding Brianna's disappearance, but I can't say that it's impossible. And I would like to have Overacker on the live show to talk through it, but I've yet to hear back from him about an appearance. When it comes to Maura, however, I'm not so sure that I like this explanation at all. Major flaw with Overacker's hypothesis, in my opinion, is with regard to why Maura was there in the first place. She wasn't walking along a road in her college town, and she wasn't driving a predictable route on her way home from work. She was in the middle of nowhere, in a place that wasn't part of the printed out routes found in her car, or in the searches she'd made the night before. And so far as investigators and the FBI could tell, she hadn't contacted anyone to say where she was going. Unlike Brianna and Michelle, she wasn't living in Vermont or New Hampshire, and so far as I can tell, none of Rooney's known victims were in the Granite State. The only way I can imagine Rooney could have come across Maura is if he was in fact living in Mountain Lakes at the time, and I don't see any evidence that he was. So what does that mean? If Maura wasn't a victim of Brian Rooney, then why was she in New Hampshire, and how did she disappear? As we've already established, the New Hampshire State Police will tell you that she intended to go missing, either to get away from her life or to end it on her own terms. But they've never been able to explain why she might have done either of those things. This is where James Renner comes in. A self-proclaimed gonzo journalist, Renner is the author of the 2016 book True Crime Addict: How I Lost Myself in the Mysterious Disappearance of Maura Murray. It's a book that Renner actively acknowledges he was explicitly asked not to write, and one that is written in a very self-centered, oddly autobiographical way. That said, it is filled with interviews that allegedly involve people Maura knew in various aspects of her life, and they form the basis of Renner's arguments. Now, he wrote an entire book, so I'll have to do a fair bit of summarizing here, and I think the best way to do that is by starting with his conclusion and then working backwards through his reasoning. Simply though, Renner thinks Maura had several reasons to leave her life behind, and that her disappearance was a carefully orchestrated attempt to get away before anyone even knew she was missing. In the 60th chapter of a book that really didn't need more than 25 of them, James Renner tells the story of a 2013 trip he made to Quebec, Canada, as he and some associates followed up on several tips suggesting Maura had been seen there. One came from an April 8, 2009 post on the website Topics, where a user on the Amherst page posted a message reading, "I saw Maura Murray alive and well in Sherbrooke, Quebec. I approached her and said, 'Hi, Maura.' She turned toward me and said, 'Hi,' then gasped and looked like she was going to pass out from shock. I have no doubt this is Maura Murray. She is apparently alive and well and living in Canada. When I saw her, she was with a very handsome young man." In a shocking coincidence, another user posting in the section for the Canadian village of Saint-Étienne de Barboina, or Barb-Harna, I don't care, it's French. Spell it right and I'll pronounce it right. Spell things how you want them to be pronounced. This goes for you too, Massachusetts. And New Hampshire, really all of you. Be better. Anyway, someone in the Canadian village of Seromnehu posted about Maura on the exact same day. That comment reading, "Maura Murray was seen in Quebec City, Quebec Province. She is alive and well. Very well. Her new squeeze is a hunk." Before going any further, I think it's important to point out a couple things about those statements. First, the phrase alive and well is used in both, and then both mention that she was with an attractive man, one of them rather more enthusiastically than the other. The shared phrasing and the repetition of the romantic themes stand out to me, and would suggest that both posts were either made by the same person, or that one was based upon the other. The first, according to Renner, was posted from a computer in Brockton, Massachusetts, while the second came from one in Houston, Texas. But that could mean someone in Brockton was using a VPN to mask their identity as being in Houston. Alternatively, Topics may have allowed users to self-designate their location, making it even easier for someone with two different accounts to post from two different places. All of this is to say that I'm a little bit skeptical about the authenticity of the sighting. I would have gone back and checked for myself, but Topics is now defunct. Of course, these aren't the only posts pointing to Maura being in Quebec, as Renner notes both in his book and on his blog. Perhaps the most famous and the most detailed was a message posted to a GeoCities page in 2009, which also alleged Maura was living in Canada at that time. The post is relatively short, so I'll go through it in full before we dive into the claims that it made. Maura Murray is not a missing person, it read. Maura Murray has the right, as every independent adult does, to leave with her new boyfriend and start a new life. Maura is living a content and satisfying life in the province of Quebec. According to the post, Maura's home life wasn't as positive as reporting had suggested. The author claimed that Fred Murray never quite forgave her for being asked to leave West Point, and that her being effectively kicked out bruised his ego beyond repair. It was his criticism, the post alleged, that led to Maura's decision to run away in favor of a new life unencumbered by the constant criticism of her father. Additionally, the author claimed that Maura's relationship with William Roche was near its end, and that, according to Maura's sister Kathleen, they were having serious problems. Maura had also allegedly met someone new, who, unlike William Roche, had no West Point connections, and therefore was not a constant reminder to her of her failure at West Point. There's already a lot to unpack here, but that's not even the real bombshell of the post, which goes on to say that on the night of February 5th, 2004, Maura took a break from her job at the security desk at a UMass dormitory to go and briefly get coffee and some food, and that sometime between 12 midnight and 1 a.m., Maura, driving her Saturn, struck and critically injured the UMass student Petrit Vasi, leaving him for dead. Now, this was not the first time that someone suggested a connection between Maura's disappearance and the hit and run of this student. The Whitman-Hanson Express published an article about it in June of 2007, but we'll come back to that in a second. The Post continues, reading around 1 a.m. to 1:20 a.m., February 6th, Maura had a complete emotional breakdown brought on by this hit-and-run accident, which was witnessed by a student who reported this to Maura's supervisor, who then came and saw that Maura needed physical help to get back to her dormitory. From there, we have a time jump to the morning of February 8th, when Maura was involved in the accident in her father's car. The author claims that the car was towed to his motel room in Hadley, and then goes on to make some rather severe allegations about what happened that night. Fred was not happy with Maura, to put it mildly, the Post reads, adding that, what happened in this motel room we'll never know, but I do know for a fact that there was some physical violence on the part of Fred Murray. Fred Murray has a history of domestic violence. The next day, Maura left for good. Again, we will come back to that because this doesn't get any less convoluted as it goes on. According to the author, Maura's crash in New Hampshire was deliberate, and for the purpose of disguising the evidence that she'd hit Vasi several nights prior. To that end, she and her new boyfriend traveled in tandem to Route 112 in New Hampshire, the author noting that he was already in southern New Hampshire, and once there, they staged the accident. Once the car was wrecked, she allegedly left it behind and walked a short ways down the road to where her boyfriend was waiting in his own vehicle. She disappeared, the letter concludes. Her only wish is that she be left alone to live her life in peace. She is happy and contented and just wants to be left alone. It's a very detailed explanation, and one that certainly does make a good argument for Maura staging her own disappearance, but there are some major problems. First of all, while Vasi's incident was at one point suggested as a possible connection, the Express pointed out that in order for Maura to have been responsible, she would have needed to somehow leave work, get to her car, drive downtown, and return all without any supervisor noticing that she'd left. There's also no surveillance footage showing Maura leaving the building, nor any evidence that she was involved in the crash. Put simply, it's pure speculation to say that she was involved, but that's not the biggest issue with the narrative. And I do want to say that whoever wrote this is a little suspicious to me, but we don't know who wrote it. But going back to the issues with this narrative, according to Julie Murray, Maura's West Point graduate sister, Maura was never asked to leave the academy. In a 2023 TikTok video, Julie explained the situation as it actually occurred, explaining that she got in trouble for taking some makeup and was sent to an honor board to determine her punishment, but that the punishment was not adjudicated before the time she decided to leave. Now, I am a graduate of West Point and know how this process works, Julie continued. I have friends who did far worse and weren't kicked out. She went on to say that sometimes you're sent to a regular army unit as an enlisted soldier for 6 months to a year and then readmitted, and that Maura's decision to leave of her own accord was informed by the ongoing wars in Afghanistan and Iraq rather than any request from the military itself. Was Fred disappointed in her? Probably a little bit, but there's no evidence that he became consistently abusive over the issue. If anything, the fact that he made a point of visiting Maura in Amherst once a month suggests that their relationship was just as good as everyone in her family claimed it was, and that this anonymous user posting the story is simply not a better source than her own immediate relatives and friends. As for the claim that he had a history of domestic abuse, there's just no evidence of that whatsoever. It is completely out of left field. There's also the issue of the claim that she had told her other sister, Kathleen, that she and Billy Roche were having relationship troubles. It's hard to say where that line of thinking originated, but one possibility is that it was the result of a misreading of a March 2nd, 2004 article in the Boston Globe. That piece contains a line about the phone call, which cites Fred Murray as saying Maura's sister called her to talk about a monstrous fight with a boyfriend. It took Kathleen a while to come forward with any details about that conversation, but in 2017, she finally broke her silence in the Oxygen Network's documentary series on the case. As it turns out, Kathleen had just been released from a rehab facility shortly before their call, and told Maura that night that she had begun drinking again. In the same interview with Maggie Frayling, Kathleen also confirmed that she was not aware of any problems between Maura and her boyfriend, so that's another point against the authenticity of the post. One last piece, which I can't totally wrap my head around, is the use of 12 MN rather than 12 AM. It's not something that most people would use, which suggests that whoever wrote this post was accustomed to using non-standard notation in their writing. From what I can tell, MN is sometimes used by medical professionals, but it's also standard notation in places like the Philippines. It's definitely a hint as to the identity of whomever wrote the post, but without further information, it's hard to say what it means. Now, Renner makes an argument that this post is potentially authentic because an accountant claimed that someone who commented on it had an IP address that traced to Taunton, Massachusetts, which was the same place that another profile on a different website with an entirely different username was also posting from, and the accountant had heard from someone else that the second username belonged to someone who was related to Maura, which is not exactly the most bulletproof argument that I've ever come across. It's kind of like saying he heard it from her father's brother's nephew's cousin's former roommate, if you will. Regardless, Renner felt that this post, combined with the two topics posts, warranted a trip to Canada. A stop in Sherbrooke, which he described as similar in scale to State College, Pennsylvania, of all places, saw him and his associates meet with a gym worker who said she believed she'd seen someone matching a photo of Maura 3 weeks prior, but also that she hadn't seen the woman since. Another young woman, a barista at a coffee shop in town, also saw a resemblance and said that Maura may have come in before. They then made a quick trip to Saint-Étienne, but upon realizing it was basically just an intersection with a candy store, they turned back for Sherbrooke. The next day, they headed to Quebec City to investigate the second sighting claim, and it was there that Renner met his next witness. She was a punk named Roxanne who worked the desk at a vintage album store called Le Knockout, I'm not kidding, and while she wasn't able to communicate with Renner particularly well at the time, she did take a flyer about Maura and then reached out about a week later via email. Two of us maybe saw Maura Murray in Quebec on Monday, December 2nd and Saturday, December 7th, it read. We speak with a girl who looks like the one you're looking for. The similitude with pictures are so intense, and her speech was weird. I think you have my phone number. Given that people from Massachusetts do have an objectively silly accent, the part about her having weird speech actually does make this a little bit more compelling. But that alone isn't enough to confirm that she'd seen Maura, and Renner knew that. Hoping for more information, he wrote back, and soon after received another email with further details. According to Roxanne, the woman she'd seen looked quite a bit like Maura, but older, around 34. In late 2013, Maura would have been about 31, so that makes sense. Roxanne went on to explain that one of her English-speaking friends was with her when she saw the woman on Monday the 2nd of December, and that he had spoken with the potential Maura. She had come into the record store and asked them where she could go for live music in Quebec City on a Monday night, and seemed disappointed when they told her there was likely nothing until Thursday or Friday. She told them she wouldn't be there by then, but then on Saturday, Roxanne saw her again, something which Roxanne said clashed her, but I can only assume that this was an attempt to communicate confusion. While in the store on Monday, she spent about 15 minutes talking with Roxanne and her friend, during which time she acted a little weird. Precise details aren't given, but apparently she wanted to go to a small show rather than a larger venue. In addition to those tidbits, this woman who might be Maura also seemed to suggest that she traveled frequently, and she refused to take a map of Quebec City venues when offered, with the explanation that in Quebec City, people do not know their town, not like other places that she supposedly travels. Roxanne clarified that this woman spoke in terms of I and not we, that her winter clothes were on the cheaper side and not meant for outdoor sports, and that when she saw her on Saturday, she wasn't wearing makeup. As for the resemblance, Roxanne was so sure that it was a match with the pictures she was shown that she reached out to the New Hampshire State Police, but, as usual, nothing came of that. Now granted, I can't imagine a less effective police pairing than the New Hampshire State Police and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, but the fact that they didn't try is still upsetting. Leaving aside the sad state of missing persons investigations north of Pennsylvania, if Renner didn't make all of that up, and remember, he's not exactly the most reputable sort of reporter, then it's certainly a bit more compelling. On the other hand, while Maura was a very attractive woman, she was not particularly unique in her appearance. She was a 5'7" brunette with an athletic build, and there are quite literally millions of women just like that in North America. Given how strong the power of suggestion is and how malleable memories can be, it's impossible to say if Roxanne really saw Maura, or if her brain just made her believe that a similar-looking woman was a closer match than she really was. If she'd seen the picture and then later identified Maura on her own, it might be a different story, but the order of events leaves me skeptical of the accuracy of Roxanne's memory. All of that said, even if Maura wasn't in Quebec, and even if the sightings were completely bogus, that doesn't mean she didn't leave of her own accord. The question is, if that is what happened, what drove her to that decision? Renner offers a few more explanations, one of which is that her relationship with Billy Roche really wasn't all that great, and that, as the GeoCities post suggested, she was running away from her relationship with him. In True Crime Addict, Renner cites an interview with Maura's aunt Janice, who allegedly told him that Billy cheated on Maura for years with one of her sister Julie's girlfriends. Usually I wouldn't be so quick to question the word of a close relative, but other things Janice said bothered me. She spoke poorly of Fred Murray, referring to him as a very odd duck who had pursued Maura's mother Lori when she was just 15 and he was a college student. And while that does appear to be the case, it's worth noting that Fred was born in 1943 and Lori in 1947. Today, a 19-year-old dating a 15-year-old would rightfully raise eyebrows, but in the 1960s it was considerably less controversial. That, however, is not the only thing that made me question Janice's perspective. Fred had a habit of taking Maura on camping trips, something that would suggest a strong bond between father and daughter. Janice, on the other hand, took issue with it. "I always thought that was strange, Maura going camping up there with her father," she told Renner. "They would share a tent. She was what, 14, 15, 16? If my dad had ever asked me to go camping alone with him and share a tent, I would have said, 'What are you, nuts?'" I can only assume that Janice didn't spend a ton of time camping, because unless you have other reasons to believe someone is a predator, this is just an absolutely insane thing with which to find an issue. Maura was considerably safer sharing a tent with her father, who could protect her from an intruder, than she was sleeping alone in a separate shelter. Janice also seemed to take some shots at Julie Murray, as she told Renner that after Maura went missing, Julie traveled up to help with the search only once, which makes complete sense considering Julie was an active duty officer in the Army at the time. She couldn't just take time off the way a civilian can. Both she and Billy had to request leave, and were only granted so much time. Janice, meanwhile, said she'd never been involved in any searches herself. Regardless, it was Janice's opinion that Maura went up to New Hampshire to get away from Fred, after they argued over her crashing his brand new car. "He really reamed her over it," Janice said, before saying that she thought the police were behind Maura's disappearance from the crash site in New Hampshire. Now, how Janice knew the details of Fred and Maura's conversation the night before she vanished is completely unexplained. The only people there were Fred and Maura, so it's actually impossible that she could know anything unless Fred told her. And it doesn't seem like he was communicating with his ex-wife's sister all that much. To Renner's credit, he didn't just take Janice at her word. He tracked down two of the last people to see Maura alive, her friends Sarah Alfieri and Kate Markopoulos, but they refused to speak with him. So he did the next best thing he could think of, and began reaching out to Maura's teammates from the UMass Track Association. Apparently, they had some very unpleasant things to say, but not necessarily just about Billy. One teammate, Nastaran Shams, did allegedly tell Renner that Maura complained of Billy cheating on her, but also implied Maura may not have been entirely innocent herself. While Nat stopped short of saying Maura cheated on her boyfriend, she did imply that something might have been going on with their assistant coach, Hussein Baghdadi. Renner claims to have tracked him down too, and though he expected Baghdadi to deny a relationship, he did precisely the opposite. According to Renner, the man fully owned up to sleeping with Maura, but he didn't stop there. "Maura Murray was a very promiscuous woman," he said. "I wasn't the only guy on the team that she had slept with." This was apparently corroborated by several other members of the team, one of whom claimed to have had first-hand knowledge of after-hour parties at the athletic pool with 3 select upperclassmen. You can infer from there what the rest of the story was, but I'm really not interested in peddling rumors with zero backing to them. Maybe if Renner had named names, I'd be more inclined to believe him, but since he refused to do so, I am skeptical about the authenticity of that story. So far, I have yet to see anyone other than James Renner make these claims about Maura's alleged promiscuity, and I've reached out to Baghdadi in hopes he can clarify. It would appear that he was not involved in these late-night soirees, and that he was seeing Maura at a time where he understood their relationship to either be over or on hold. "We hung out at the end of the semester in 2003, he told Renner. Then she went home for the summer. She visited him once in Amherst over the summer, and then they stayed in touch over the phone and through email, but suddenly all of that stopped. I got this random email about her boyfriend," he said. "They had started things back up. She left whatever we had." Part of the reason I'm skeptical of Renner is that several times I noticed him making deceiving statements in his book. For example, in chapter 47, he says the story Fred told a searcher named Rick Graves didn't line up with the story in the newspapers about the night she crashed Fred's car. Renner goes on to quote Graves as saying, "When Maura drove to Fred's motel that night, the manager called Fred's room and told him to come to the lobby. Fred told me that when he got there, he found Maura slumped over a chair crying. He never told me what she was crying about, but nothing about that conflicts with what Fred told the papers. And Renner doesn't actually explain how he feels it's contradictory. And while I didn't include it in the quote, he straight up says Fred lied about what happened with the police. And as I said, he does not explain that. Anyway, another instance of what I considered to be misrepresentation came with the chapter about Kate Markopoulos, who he described as being obstinately silent during his attempts to get information from her. Leaving aside the fact that Renner was basically harassing anyone who wouldn't speak to him in order to write a book that Maura's family explicitly told him they didn't want him to write, the way he talks about his eventual conversation with Kate is just weird. Again, self-proclaimed gonzo journalist. Anyway, the quote, Kate provided a lot of inconsequential details, he writes. She and Maura liked watching Bottle Rocket, a movie about a couple of friends who steal some money and then go into hiding until they're caught by police. They often went shopping together. Now in the business, we call this priming the reader, because the very next set of details are only inconsequential if you're looking to ignore evidence against your own case. Maura was planning to move to Oklahoma to be with Billy, Kate told him, but she wasn't thrilled about moving. It was the middle of nowhere. She was going to get a job at a hospital. She was going to move because she loved him. Additionally, Kate said that Maura and her father had a fantastic relationship and that she loved him very much. So, one of the only people close to Maura at school said she had a great relationship with her father, that she loved her boyfriend, and that she was planning to move to Oklahoma, but that's irrelevant somehow. That's an inconsequential detail. Absolutely none of those things are inconsequential, considering what Renner is trying to argue. I mean, his entire argument so far hinges on the idea that she was trying to run away from her life, and yet Kate directly told him she liked her life. Now, to be fair, Kate did allegedly tell Renner, the more I think about it, the more I realize I didn't really know her, but that doesn't mean she somehow misunderstood every single thing about a girl she spent about 20 hours a week with. The other part that bothers me about the chapter is the end, where Renner describes how he reached out for some clarification about who was present at Sarah's dorm party the night before Maura disappeared. Kate replied via email, writing, I understand it would be helpful if I could remember names, but it is just not happening. It was long ago, and I barely knew these people, nor would I see some of them again. Renner writes, that last sentence is hinky. Nor would I see some of them again? Which of them did she see again? Thing is, that statement isn't hinky at all. It was a party at a large state college. If you've ever been to one of those, chances are you have crossed paths with people you never saw again. The ones she did see again were probably her friends, like Sarah, whose dorm room the party was in. Renner attended Kent State University, so I can't imagine he doesn't know this. Now, of course, it is possible that nobody was inviting James Renner to parties at Kent State University, and this is starting to make more sense. The real doozy, however, is the last sentence of the chapter. It wasn't until much later that I learned that Kate Markopoulos had a very good reason to avoid police and reporters. Now, you might be expecting that this line has a payoff later in the book. It does not. In my opinion, Renner was frustrated with Kate because she wouldn't confirm what Nast and Hussein had told him about Maura's promiscuity, something of which it would appear he was the first to inform Billy Roche. In chapter 56, Renner outlines a conversation he claims to have had with Billy. And off the bat, I noticed he quoted Maura's former boyfriend as saying that she got an honor code violation at West Point because she stole a granola bar from a store. Julie, however, said it was makeup. Next, he pointed out that Billy said the party that night happened off campus rather than at Sarah's dorm. And for some reason, Renner immediately used that to call Kate's version of the story into question. Occam's razor would suggest that Billy, who was in Oklahoma at the time, had his facts mixed up. Instead, Renner presents it as if it's proof that Kate was lying. The more interesting part of this conversation was about a printed out email allegedly found in Maura's dorm room when police searched it after her disappearance. According to Renner, Billy said that this was a letter that had to do with him seeing another woman, but that it was more complicated than the police let on. Billy said that the other woman was a girl he'd been dating before he met Maura, and that he'd reconnected with her in some capacity. The complicated part was that Maura and Billy were not together when he saw this old girlfriend again. In my opinion, however, the complicated part is Billy saying that this email existed in the first place, because it's the very same one Fred explicitly told Governor Lynch didn't exist. Not only that, but an article in the UMass Amherst student paper, the Daily Collegian, quotes Billy's own mother as saying, there is no note. Furthermore, she said that Billy himself said there were no recent letters between the two of them found in the dorm room. Beyond that, Sharon never said a word about the couple having broken up at any point in 2003, but rather referred to a point where the couple's relationship was rocky in the spring of 2002. But they had resolved their problems by summer and had a good relationship since then. As far as she was aware, as far as Kathleen was aware, and as far as Fred was aware, Maura and Billy were on good terms when she disappeared, and the email she actually did send him that day suggested the same to be the case. This isn't to say that it's impossible that she and Billy were in some sort of rocky situation in 2004, or that Billy was necessarily the best kind of person. Some questions have been raised in recent years due to a criminal trial against Roche, which saw him convicted of misdemeanor simple assault in 2022. There also appears to have been a civil case against Roche in 2019, potentially brought by the same plaintiff, though the only reporting I can find on that comes from Renner, and he didn't give the name of the victim. What is certain is that Billy was very involved in the search for Maura Murray, and that he had an airtight alibi on the night she disappeared. Renner himself confirms he saw the call logs from Billy's phone, and was able to confirm that he was in Oklahoma, and there is simply no evidence to suggest that Roche somehow coordinated an attack against Maura. Even if he wanted to for some reason, how would he have known where she was going? I mean, that's the real question, isn't it? Where was Maura going? Why was she going there? When I started writing this episode, the thing that made the most sense to me was that Maura's arrest in November of 2003 might have something to do with it. The sentence for her crime, misdemeanor improper use of a credit card, in an amount under $250, carried a maximum sentence of 1 year in prison and a fine. But she was essentially let off the hook on the condition that she didn't get into trouble for 6 months. And though she wasn't given a sobriety test on the night she crashed her father's car, it could be possible she was worried that some other minor criminal charge might be headed her way, and that she panicked over the potential jail time that might bring. If that were the case, it would explain why she up and left so quickly, and why she printed out directions to a place she wasn't going. But does that really make sense? To leave behind an entire life and a loving family just to avoid the mere potential of being sent to jail for a year? In all likelihood, she'd have received community service and probation, and that was if charges were brought against her at all. And even if she had decided to disappear, would she have really done so without telling anyone at all close to her? I think the answer to that lies within a reframing of the question itself. Renner, Overacker, and many others who have covered the case have tried to account for the entire story as though Maura's decision to leave Amherst and her disappearance from Haverhill are directly connected. But I think that part of the reason this case is so confusing, and part of the reason it's never been solved, is that they probably aren't. Rather than being the mystery of why Maura wanted to disappear or how a killer lured her to the crash site, it's two mysteries rolled into one. There is the mystery of what happened to Maura Murray after that crash in New Hampshire, and there is also the mystery of why she left Amherst in the first place. I don't think that a serial killer is necessary to explain how Maura vanished, nor do I think that an intention to disappear is necessary to explain why she ended up on that road. In fact, I don't think Maura intended to disappear at all. I think she fully expected to return to Amherst, probably after about a week. I think that she meant it when she promised to call her father and boyfriend later that night, and I think someone else prevented her from doing so. Let's review the facts. Maura had been making erratic decisions in the days before she disappeared. She was drinking more heavily than usual, taking bizarre risks, and according to Renner's interviews with her teammates, she'd been unusually withdrawn since returning from winter break. She was crying at work and wouldn't tell anyone why. She told her boyfriend she didn't feel much like talking to anyone the day she disappeared. She then left without telling anyone where she was going, but did express that she would be gone for about a week. She packed a week's worth of clothes, her textbooks, birth control pills, a book to read, and most of the cash in her bank account. She printed out directions to northern Vermont, but didn't tell anyone, not even her family, why she was going there. And when she crashed her car, a car registered in her father's name, she asked witnesses not to call the police. To me, these aren't signs that she wanted to die or disappear forever. They're signs that she was trying to do something without her family finding out she'd done it. Maura's parents were Catholic. Her mother was a nurse and her father a traveling medical technician. Her boyfriend lived halfway across the country, and whether the rumors were true or not, their relationship definitely wasn't as stable as it could have been. Add in the fact that it was 2004 and the country was considerably more socially conservative than it is today, and I think the evidence points towards one very simple conclusion. Maura Murray was pregnant, and she was traveling to Burlington because she was planning to get an abortion. Now you may be thinking, but Aiden, wasn't abortion legal in Massachusetts in 2004? Yes, it was. But when your Catholic parents live in Massachusetts and work in the medical field, you might not want to take the risk that word could spread. Burlington has a Planned Parenthood clinic that I confirmed does provide abortion services, and Maura may have felt that her best chance to avoid anyone finding out about the procedure would be to have it done in another state far from any network her parents might be connected with. I believe this explains her decision to leave and her odd behavior in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. but it doesn't explain why she was on Wild Emanusik Road, or how she ended up going missing from that location, but it may not need to. First, let's cover how she got so off track, because that question has been bugging me the entire time I've been looking into this case, and I do have to credit Renner for making me aware of a possible answer, though I of course confirmed that his reporting was correct before going this route. It seems that there was some overlap between the UMass track team and the UMass outing club, and the latter of those two has a cabin on Mount Agassiz, I'm definitely getting this one wrong, outside of Bethlehem, New Hampshire. Maura may have been there before, or at the very least known of its existence through her friends, and could have been attempting to reach it in order to stay the night. The cabin is only about 22 miles from the crash site, and you can get to it from there by taking Route 112 east to Route 116. It's not the most direct route, but if it's getting late and you only have a general idea of where you are, and your car is running on 3 cylinders, it's not out of the question to end up going that way. And as Sergeant Smith reported, evidence at the scene indicated that the vehicle had been eastbound and had gone off the roadway, struck some trees, spun around, and come to rest facing the wrong way in the eastbound lane. Her lack of familiarity with the road, as well as the darkness and the potentially icy conditions, could account for her taking the turn where she crashed too quickly, while the possibility that she was trying to get to the cabin could be why her scent trail led eastward. As for why she didn't wait for the police, she probably knew they'd try to book her for a DUI due to the open wine box. Whether she'd been drinking or driving or not, she was in a small town in another state with an open package of alcohol, and she probably would have known she wasn't getting off as easy as she had 2 nights prior. The alcohol she packed, including the bottles missing from the car, might have been her way of paying the outing club back for her stay at the cabin, or it may have just been for her to get through what was sure to be a stressful week. She also could have brought it along in hopes of trading it for a ride or lodging, but the point is that she had reasons not to leave it behind in the car, and she had a backpack in which to carry it. It's also possible that her decision-making was simply compromised due to a head injury sustained during the accident, so there's any number of reasons why she would have taken it with her and left the scene. From there, we have just one last question to answer. Where did she go? I think the most plausible answer is that she was abducted, either by a passing traveler or by somebody who lived in the area. There were no tracks leading off into the 2-foot-deep snow anywhere near the scene, dogs lost her scent from the middle of the road, and in 21 years, multiple searches have never turned up a body or even so much as an item belonging to Maura. Maybe those cadaver dogs did find something in that closet in 2006, or maybe the other team did in 2018. But if they did, it's on the New Hampshire State Police to perform a proper investigation. I won't be holding my breath on that, because they know it's easier to wait for Fred Marie to die. Maura's mother, her sister Kathleen, and her brother Fred Jr. have already departed this world, which means there aren't many people left to fight for Maura. Her sister Julie has in recent years taken up the mantle, and she is a force to be reckoned with, but she alone may not be able to force the authorities to do what's right. And if she does manage to get them to dig into those leads, but nothing comes of it, that could shut down any future investigations for good. As for who could be responsible for Maura's abduction, I don't feel comfortable speculating any further than her family already has. There are reasons to question Butch Atwood's story, but many already have, and nothing has come of it. The same can be said for the Westmans, who were a little too eager to get the Murrays to stop searching their property and those surrounding it, at least in my opinion, but there's no hard evidence that they did anything to her. Then there's the police, who seemed entirely disinterested at best and deceptive at worst. Were they incompetent? Were they lazy? Or were they deliberately sabotaging the investigation for some reason or another? The fact that they refused to bring in the FBI makes me think they were hiding something, and that at the very least they cared more about their egos than solving the case. But does that mean they're complicit? Without further evidence, it's impossible to say for certain. As I said earlier, I do think that that note posted on GeoCities is extraordinarily suspicious, and that whoever wrote it could very well be responsible for Maura's disappearance. However, that was posted 16 years ago. It appears that it was forwarded to the New Hampshire State Police, and while I do not believe for a second that they actually tried to look into it, it would be nearly impossible to track down whoever posted it now. So all we can say is that someone out there almost certainly knows what happened to Maura Murray. And whoever they are, it's time to come forward and finally give her family the peace they deserve. Now, I am sure there are going to be comments that are saying all sorts of things about me being wrong, and I am open to being incorrect. I'm going to reach out to Julie Murray and ask her if she'd like to come on the show and chat. I'm going to reach out to Greg Overacker again. Also, there are a couple of guys behind the podcast, Missing Maura, I believe it's called. I'm going to see if I can get them to come on. I would genuinely love to talk to more people involved in investigating and covering this case, to see if I have any gaps, to see if they think I'm right about anything. And hopefully we can move the needle a little bit. I know that this case was dead in the water for a little while, but over the last few years, Julie Murray has been hitting it hard. We'd love to be able to help in any way that we can, so our platform is open to anyone who has information and is looking to share it. Now, if you would like to support what we do here at the Lore Lodge, there are a number of ways you can do that. You can check us out on Patreon for $1 a month. We've got some exclusive content over there and even more coming out. We just need to hire an editor so that Aiden can, not do all of it himself. And if you subscribe to Patreon, it'll actually help us do that. Right now, we feel that we're about one editor's salary away from being able to actually provide all of the stuff we want to provide, so subscribing to Patreon helps that happen. If you're looking for more material benefits, we do have our coffee. You can buy that from TableauRoastingCo.com. I designed it myself. I didn't just pick it off a shelf. We also have merch from Bunker Branding. It's so cozy. The links to all of that are linked in the description if you'd like to check any of it out, and we really appreciate it if you do. We also have our Discord server, which is also linked in the description. That's where you can get all of the updates for everything as it comes out. And if you're looking for more Lodge, you can check us out on History Unhinged, The Weird Bible, or my personal channel, Aiden Mattis, where I typically stream games on Friday, and I'm trying to get back into doing some commentary streams. And of course, there is our live show, which is Monday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern, unless it's not, and if it's not, we'll let you know when it is. So, with all that said, thank you for watching. Let me know if I got anything wrong. Let me know if I got anything right, and we'll see you next time. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.